Endgame, RABID States Book 5, written by Scott Medbury, narrated by Adam Barr. 1. A flicker of light, warmth on his face, an agony in his head and legs. Crowley blinked slowly and processed the searing brightness, trying to get it into focus. Slowly, the dancing light turned into flames, and he noticed that it was coming from just ahead of him, on the road, from an upturned truck. A gun fired nearby, a horrid scream, and then another gunshot. Crowley tried to get up, but the pain in his head stopped him, and he rolled onto his back, staring at the smoke wending its way into the sky. "Get the others out! Go!" Crowley heard a familiar voice scream. Tires screeched. Someone was crying. Someone else moaning. What felt like hours passed. Then the darkness reclaimed him. Teddy stood over the bullet-riddled body of Mancini, wiping tears and blood out of his eyes. A great breath rumbled from him as he looked around at the carnage. Bodies from the truck were scattered over the road, and a small group who'd survived the turnover were huddled together, checking and comforting each other. The truck was 30 yards away, flipped on its side, the cabin burning. The captain was nowhere to be seen. Teddy felt a cold steel ball in the pit of his belly. Ahead, the other vehicles had pulled up, and in the distance, he could see Billy and Josephine doing their best to stop the other survivors from rushing back. "Stiles, get these people up to the other vehicles. Squeeze them into the 2 trucks and leave the Hummer. There should be an old truck stop in 3 miles. Stop there. Have Maria see to their entries. We'll be along as soon as we've—" Teddy couldn't bring himself to say, "found the captain," for some reason. Stiles got it, though. "Yes, sir." He helped Stiles and a couple of other men get the injured civilians to their feet. Miraculously, none of them seemed to have sustained anything more than light injuries. As he watched them go, he saw Josephine take a step in his direction, and he put up his hand. "It's fine, Joe. Help the injured. We'll catch up." She cocked her head, clearly wondering where Crowley was. But he gave her the thumbs up. She took another step, but by then Stiles and the civilians were approaching, and she rushed to help a woman who stumbled forward. He let out a sigh of relief. Shadows were lengthening. "Get down to the truck. We need to locate the captain." Rogers put a hand on his. "If he was still on that truck when it rolled, sir, he's gone." "What the hell did you say?" Teddy yelled, rounding on him, grabbing his shirt and pulling him in. "You're a fucking traitor. You don't get a say in anything." Rogers put his hands up as Carter rushed in to break them apart. Teddy didn't relent until Carter said, "Sir, the captain." Then the sergeant pushed Rogers onto his backside and stalked towards the truck. "Fuck you," said Rogers to the sergeant's back. Carter put a hand on his shoulder. "Don't take it too hard. He's just worried about the captain. They're best friends. Come on." Rogers dusted himself off and spat on the ground, the look in his eyes far from forgiving as he followed Carter. Teddy saw no bodies in the ditch near the resting place of the burning truck. He knelt and looked under the flatbed tray. It angled down from what was left of the cabin, so he had an easy view. No bodies. That was a good sign. He stood up and approached the truck cabin, pointing to indicate Carter and Rogers should fan out to see if they could locate any survivors in the long grass to the west of the truck. He knew that Crowley wasn't in the burning cabin, and by sending the other 2 further afield, he made it a certainty that he wouldn't be the one to find the captain's twisted body lying on the ground like a piece of roadkill. "Christ, Thaddeus, shut it," he rebuked himself under his breath. The roof of the burning cabin was squashed to seat level. Steeling himself, he knelt, protecting his face from the heat with his arm, and looked in to try and identify the driver. For the life of him, he couldn't. It was a woman. He could see that much from the long brown hair protruding from the jagged opening in the crushed door where the window used to be. Unfortunately, or fortunately, her face was hidden under the compacted metal. He stood up again and rounded the corner of the cabin. Oh no. It was all he could say when he found the body of the little girl, Nadine, on the grass in front of the wreck. She was lying on her back, her eyes closed and her face peaceful. She could have been asleep but for the fact that her chest wasn't moving. And Teddy was immediately reminded of a picture that had haunted him when he'd seen it in his teens, of Evelyn McHale, the woman dubbed the most beautiful suicide by the press in the late 40s. A sob escaped his throat. Sergeant Thaddeus O'Keefe had seen a lot of death in his 38 years, but the death of a child always hit him hard. He dropped to his knees next to her and smoothed the hair away from her forehead, careful not to touch the skin of her face, knowing he'd lose his shit completely if he felt warmth. Fuck. Sorry, kid, he said, and began to pray quietly. Sarge! Teddy didn't respond until he'd finished and said amen, then climbed to his feet with leaden legs and followed the sound of Carter's voice. Carter was on his knees by a figure on the ground, Rogers a few feet to his right. Teddy couldn't bring himself to move with any urgency, knowing there was no way his friend was alive. Dead? He asked in a wooden voice. No, he's banged up and out of it, but his pulse is strong. Something like a wave of euphoria washed over Teddy, and the energy carried him the rest of the way in a sprint. He gave Crowley a cursory examination. Apart from a bruised lump on his forehead and scratches and abrasions, he looked to be intact. There were no heavy bleeds or awkward angles to show obvious breaks. Lucky bastard, he said under his breath. Come on, let's get him to the Humvee. He and Carter hoisted the captain between them and began carrying him up the road, the toes of the taller man's boots dragging along the ground. They slowly carried Crowley over to the Humvee that sat parked on an angle to the road, skid marks all the way behind it for a good 50 or more yards. The light from the fire behind them cast long, hellish shadows of them right across the asphalt, then down into the grassy field. After they'd wrestled Crowley into the passenger seat as gently as they could, Teddy eased the seatbelt around him. The captain groaned, but didn't open his eyes, and his friend worried about internal injuries. Who knew how much damage he'd taken when he was thrown from the truck? Rest up, buddy, he said, before going around and jumping in the driver's seat, as the other two piled in back. Where now? Carter asked. Sioux Falls. What about Billy and the others? They'll be waiting for us where I told them, or they can find their own way there. Carter smiled and looked out the window, knowing full well that the Sarge's bluster was just that. Teddy put the Humvee into drive, and they were soon leaving the wreckage behind them. No time to mourn the dead now, only to give thanks that he and Crowley weren't amongst them. Teddy pat his pants pocket and felt the hard shape of Mancini's prized pocket knife. He barely remembered picking it up as he stood over the poor bastard. It was something the soldier treasured, and he thought the kid would have wanted someone to have it, instead of it being left to gather dust as its owner's corpse rotted next to it. Teddy would keep it until he could pass it on to someone he thought would value it. 2. The truck stop car was filled with children's crying and whimpers from the injured civilians who Maria was tending to. Billy was still in shock at what had occurred, and spattered with the blood of the injured, moved around lending assistance where he could. He spotted Josephine holding the baby a few yards away and went across to her. "How are you doing?" he asked. Josephine jerked in surprise. He made a face and held up his hands in apology.
It's fine, Billy. Sorry, I'm a little jumpy, I guess.
I get that. We sure have been through hell. But I guess that doesn't begin to describe what happened with Mancini.
He cleared his throat and licked his bottom lip, leaving the captain's unknown fate out of the conversation. She caught his hesitation and saw a look of worry cross her face. It was gone in an instant.
I'm sure Teddy will have the captain and any other survivors along soon,
he said quickly. Josephine smoothed little Ed's hair as he slept soundly.
I'm sure they will, too. Have you done a head count?
Yeah, 2 missing. The girl, Faith, and one of the kids. The girl you rescued from...
Nadine?
Yes. She's missing, too. I think they were in the truck, but they weren't amongst the people who jumped off.
Josephine walked off without saying goodbye. In the haste of their escape, Faith had volunteered to drive the truck, and she had been so preoccupied with getting the others to safety as the soldiers took rear guard action that she'd said yes. She'd die if anything had happened to those girls. Crowley had been conscious for less than 5 minutes and already wished he'd died. The pain and bruising in his ribs told him he'd fractured at least one. But given the fact he wasn't choking blood, it was a hairline at best. There was no doubt he'd gotten lucky. Apart from that, there was a painful gravel rash down the left side of his body where he'd skidded along the ground after jumping, and a massive lump on his forehead where at some point he'd face-planted what surely must have been a rock. Lucky indeed. Teddy told him the sitrep and that the other vehicles were waiting up ahead. He also informed him of the 2 casualties, little Nadine and a woman he wasn't able to identify. Crowley knew Josephine would be devastated about Nadine, and he would gladly have taken more pain to avoid witnessing the hurt in her eyes when the time came to tell her. As to the dead driver, he'd find out soon enough.
You look like shit, Captain.
Gee, thanks.
Good to have you back with us, sir, said Carter from the back seat. I thought you were a goner. Yep, agreed Rogers. You're one tough son of a bitch, Captain.
Crowley noticed Teddy's scowl, but was happy he had nothing to say to Rogers. The last thing he needed was more acrimony amongst his troops after the Mancini episode. Crowley closed his eyes and could still see his transformation. The eyes changing, the teeth, the drooling. He hadn't looked like the other rabid people they'd encountered at the prison. The deformities and size increase obviously occurred over a longer period of time, thank God, because dealing with a relatively unchanged soldier had been difficult enough, but it was enough to scare the hell out of Crowley. Next time, even so much as a suspicion of the possibility of a bite would mean isolation and observation of the victim at a distance, and maximum prejudice if a bite was confirmed.
Here,
Rogers said to Crowley, offering him a single painkiller and a flask of water.
Saved it for an emergency.
Crowley held up a hand.
No, thanks, Rogers, but I'm good. Keep it.
No, sir. You've been through the wars, and I think this classifies as an emergency. Please. He's right, Captain. Don't be a stubborn ass,
opined Teddy from the driver's seat.
Good job, Rogers.
Partly because he didn't want to upset the slight thaw of relations between his second-in-charge and the recent recruit, and partly because his ribs were screaming agony, Crowley relented.
Sure,
he said, taking the capsule and the water bottle.
Why not?
He knocked it back, took a single gulp of water, and thanked Rogers. After he wiped his mouth, he leaned toward Teddy and winced when his ribs protested.
Where are we, Teddy?
We passed a sign a mile back that said 3 miles, so I'd say 5 minutes from reuniting with the rest of the group, sir.
Good stuff,
said Crowley, leaning back and closing his eyes.
Just avoid any potholes, okay?
3.
"We're here," Teddy said.
Startling Crowley from his fitful slumber. Groggily, he peered through the windshield as the truck stop emerged from the dark. The convoy, now numbering just 2, stood under the awning covering the old fuel Bowsers. He didn't see any of their group.
"Where is everybody?"
he asked Teddy, as the sergeant slowed the Hummer to a stop. A sudden knock on the driver's side window with the stock of a rifle made them both jump before Stiles' face appeared behind the glass.
"Jesus, Stiles, you clown,"
Teddy said, jamming the Hummer into park and stepping out.
"Sorry, didn't mean to scare you, Sarge."
"You son of a bitch,"
Teddy laughed. "You didn't scare me. The captain maybe, but not me."
Crowley gave a half-hearted smile and then, gritting his teeth, opened the door and climbed out of the Humvee. Seeing the familiar faces of the captain and sergeant, the rest of the group came to greet them. There was lots of hugging, and Billy even embraced Teddy before peeling away from him and punching him hard in the arm. Josephine stood at the back. She made eye contact with Crowley and smiled, but he saw the worry in her eyes as she looked past him, no doubt searching for the 2 girls. He made his way through the group and took her in his arms without thinking, gasping at the stab of pain in his ribs.
"Sorry,"
she said, releasing him and looking into his eyes. "I'll be fine. But listen, I have some bad news," he said.
"Nadine? Faith?"
Faith. One of the older kids Josephine had helped. That's who was driving, he realized. He nodded somberly. Tears welled in her eyes.
"Jesus. Both of them?"
Crowley took her hands. They were in the cab. Both died on impact. It was quick. Josephine gritted her teeth and nodded. He knew there was nothing to say. They'd seen enough loss since the school to both recognize that words were unnecessary.
"What now?"
"We regroup, figure out what the hell our plan is."
"Fair enough."
Crowley rounded up everyone between the truck and the Humvee and stood up on the road to give himself a bit of height and position to project his voice so the group, albeit now smaller, could hear him. "We've lost a lot already. We've been through hell, and some of us will still be in shock from what happened back at Blue Creek. Crowley paused, clutching his ribs, and took a moment to catch his breath. "I, nevertheless, need to set things straight. As some of you know, Dougie and I intercepted a radio transmission during our second recon of Blue Creek, before the shootout. The radio transmission confirmed the suspicions and hopes of many that there is a safe haven in South Dakota. The transmission in question specified that the sanctuary is based in Sioux Falls, which is a large city in the southeast of the state, and that they have the capacity to take on an additional 5,000 people. Hopeful murmurs and smiles lit up across the group. But it's not all good news. We have, as my watch tells me, just over 43 hours to get there. Luckily, we still have 3 smaller vehicles.
Captain, sorry, but the van has a broken axle,"
said Stiles. Christ, how?
"That big mother of a pothole 2 miles back." "Sorry,"
Stiles said, a little sheepishly. "Okay, that leaves us the Hummer and the Ram. 16 of us and 2 vehicles. We're going to need a 3rd vehicle if we want to get to Sioux Falls in time." "Why don't you and a few of your men go on ahead?" Billy called from the grass, hands in his pockets. "What?" said Crowley flatly. "No, we're not splitting up." "But you could get there in what, 3 or 4 hours? Form a rescue party and come back for us."
Teddy shook his head. "If this safe haven is going into lockdown in less than 2 days, I'm willing to bet they won't be in the mood to send a charity extraction for a few civilians."
"Teddy's right," Crowley boomed again. taking back the conversation. "We don't know the terrain. We don't know anything. Our best bet is to continue north after we get off the I-80, with civilians and half the squad in the vehicles and the other half jogging. That way we keep you guys safe and rested, and we rotate the squad, so we have fresh legs on the go. Next town we come by, we'll get ourselves a third vehicle. No splitting up. No leaving anyone behind." Maria, with baby Ed in her arms, stepped forward next to Josephine and looked up at Crowley.
"We're with you, Captain. If there's a place we can finally sleep safe at night, a place for the kids, we'll go on no matter what."
Crowley nodded. "Damn straight. Now, first, we rest. I'll take first watch."
"The hell you will, Captain. No offense,"
said Carter. "None taken. Guess I could take the second."
"Nope. I'll take the second watch. You need to recuperate," interjected Teddy.
Crowley was about to protest, but the look on Josephine's face told him he'd have to go through her if he wanted to do anything other than sleep. "Fine. Get some shut-eye, the rest of you. We leave at sunrise." He took Dougie and Rogers aside and explained that they would need to take a turn at jogging on the first changeover to help keep everyone's legs fresh as they made their way to the next town. They had no complaints. Crowley retired to the grass with the rest of them, bedding down next to Joe. They shared a brief kiss, and then she nestled against him without speaking. They were both exhausted, and words could wait. When the sun was beginning to lighten the eastern sky, Josephine roused from sleep groggily. She was cold and realized that Crowley had rolled over onto his other side sometime in the night. In the silence before the dawn, she heard the faint sound of moving water. She climbed up from her jacket she had slept on, careful not to disturb Crowley, and smiled when she saw Ed and Emily snuggled between Maria and Maureen. She set off into the longer grass and followed the sound of the running water down to the bank of a tiny, rocky creek. Josephine walked down to the edge and squatted, cupping her hands into the creek and splashing her face with the cold water. If she hadn't been quite awake, the icy water did the trick as well as a dose of smelling salts would have. She stood and tucked her cold hands into her jean pockets, staring into the babbling water as her thoughts drifted to Grandpa. Events had moved so quickly since the ambush at the prison that she hadn't had time to grieve him properly. She thought about the time they had spent together when she was a child, the piggybacks, the board games they had played, the hugs at birthdays, the dinners at Thanksgiving and Christmas. His proud face beaming at her from the audience at school concerts and graduation. She picked up a pebble and skimmed it across the water. Unsatisfied, she picked up another and hurled it. This time it made a plunk sound as it splashed and disappeared out of sight. "You trying to catch us breakfast?" Josephine turned. The rising sun caught Crowley standing on a big rock, looking handsome but as worn as his battered army fatigues. He smiled down at her.
"Morning,"
Josephine called up to him. "Morning."
"We headed out?"
"We are. I came to round you up. We need to move it pronto if we're going to meet the curfew for Sioux Falls." Josephine nodded as she let it sink in. All the events of the previous day rushed through her head in a blur. The fighting, the gunfire, the blood, Mancini, the crash, Nadine and Faith.
"Right,"
she finally said.
"Yeah. What is that ETA?"
Crowley looked down at his left wrist and squinted. "We slept too long as it is. We've got about 33 hours left. If we find a vehicle, we're in business. If not..."
"Then we're screwed,"
Josephine finished. "Yeah."
"Right then, Captain. Let's get a move on."
Josephine smiled as she joined them, and they headed back to the vehicles, letting her cheery facade do the work, hiding the pain and anguish still locked up inside. This was no time to let it surface. She would suck it up like the soldiers did and march on into battle. If not for herself, for little Ed and Emily and the rest of them. Within 5 minutes, the group had the last scraps of rations packed and on board the Humvee and Ram. As they piled the civilians and soldiers who were riding the first shift into the two vehicles, it got tight very quickly. As a result, more of the soldiers, including Rogers, took to the road to walk on ahead. That left room for Billy to drive the Ram, Stiles the Humvee, with the rest of the group spread out into the other seats and the tray of the Ram. By lunch, the sun was high, the morning cloud cover long gone, revealing a periwinkle blue sky. It was also warmer than expected. A good 6 hours of slow driving and walking meant they had covered just under 18 miles and were finally coming up to their first town. Crowley drained the last of the water once the civilians and all his squad had taken a few gulps of their own. He put the flask back in his backpack and squinted ahead. Finally. Walking an interstate really isn't the same as driving it.
No shit,
Teddy replied, which got a chuckle from Dustin. They kept on going, taking a left off the interstate toward the town, navigating a dusty-looking crossroad before entering the town consisting of maybe a dozen or so buildings. At a signal from Crowley, he, Teddy, and Stiles peeled off from the rest quickly with a sharp jog, guns in hand.
"Notice you let Rogers keep your prized shotgun,"
Stiles remarked as they slowed to a fast walk to round the first block, all three raising their rifles to the rooftops and around corners. Teddy snorted.
"Figured he needed it more than I did."
"Really?" Crowley asked, genuinely surprised by his answer. "You love that thing."
"Well, I figured it was time to start trusting him. I've been pretty hard on him, and he has stayed true. Plus, we need all the manpower we can get. Doesn't make sense to me," Stiles replied.
Teddy lowered his rifle down once they were satisfied, already sure the small town was empty, given they could almost see each corner of it from where they stood on the second block.
"Doesn't have to," Teddy retorted. "My choice, my gun." "Not anymore, it isn't."
"Shut up, both of you," Crowley snapped and motioned to a driveway between two stores at the end of the block. In the shadows sat a dark red Chevy sedan with a jerry can on the trunk.
"No way that's not a trap,"
whispered Stiles. "Only one way to find out," Crowley said. Fortunately, it wasn't a trap, but unfortunately, the jerry can was as empty as the car's fuel tank. They were soon joined by the rest of their group, who scoured the place for a single drop of gas or another vehicle, but they had no luck. Demoralized, tired, and with just a few tins of beans, apricots, and a few bottles of water refilled from an old office cooler, they were back on the interstate within the hour, following the river east. With not half an hour under their belts, and the sticky apricot juice still fresh on Crowley's mouth, they spied a shifting mass up ahead. Small, but moving as one. Crowley raised a hand, signaling everyone to halt. They stopped. Crowley looked to Billy in the Humvee, then back to his squad. Their expressions were wide-eyed and knowing, mouths set, hands clutching their guns. He turned back and stared up at the small horde of rabid creatures loping across the I-80, directly in their path. 4. Crowley took a deep breath and processed the danger in front of them. With Teddy on his left and Stiles on his right, he motioned for them to take flanking positions on either side of the road. Then he ordered Dougie and Rogers to go either side with the others. Behind him, he motioned with his hand for Carter and Dustin to keep in tow with him and waved to Billy to stay put. Billy gave the nod, his face visible even from the road. He looked like a man ready to face death head-on. Slowly, one foot after the other, they moved forwards toward the horde. When he was as close as he dared, Crowley motioned for his men to stop. He raised his rifle and put his eye to the scope. He saw a group of rabid dogs, sniffing and foraging in the undergrowth, and amongst them, humans, who had mutated into something else completely and moved on all fours, making it difficult to distinguish them from the canines. Strange how they moved together, he thought. Something about the virus seemed to make humans and canines act as one species. Crowley checked his clip and looked back to the others, signaling to check ammunition. They were all low. The last fight had depleted their stocks greatly. They would have to be tactical then, and precise. Short bursts and headshots only. Crowley motioned to his men and tapped his head. He held up 3 fingers to signal burst shots, and they all responded in the affirmative. He gave the motion to move. The plan, in his head, was to spread the pack, disorganize and confuse. When he was close enough to hear the growls and grunts, he raised his hand to Teddy and jabbed it in the direction of the infected. Teddy and Rogers began running and opened fire in short or single bursts, popping steadily through the horde with headshots. A few went wide, taking body shots, but already 4 or 5 had been downed before a chorus of gut-wrenching growls and screams filled the air. The hairs on the back of Crowley's neck bristled, and his adrenaline spiked. The rabid creatures started to turn and charge on Teddy's position, but not before Stiles and Dougie had been ordered to attack from the other flank, grabbing the attention of the small horde with a few kills of their own. With the group thinning across the road, unaware of Crowley and the rest coming up the middle or the Humvee sitting idle a few hundred yards up the interstate, he motioned to Dustin and Carter to follow. They did so, and when the rabid pack finally noticed them, Crowley's eyes narrowed, and he shouted his next command. "Fire at will!" Dustin and Carter flanked Crowley, peppering the rabid creatures with shots, as did Crowley, taking as many heads as he could. As he'd hoped, the rabid beasts went berserk, confused by the onslaught from all angles. They lurched and thrashed, one almost taking Stiles out. But in the frenzy, their movements took on a whole other pattern. They were turning as one to flee. Crowley stared in disbelief. Apart from a few stragglers that were already engaged, the rest of the surviving horde branched off and hightailed it directly east, away from them. "Pursue and destroy!" Crowley yelled. He couldn't let them escape to roam free and become a problem later on. They had to die now, every last one of them. His men charged forward, excited at the prospect of a turkey shoot. "Headshots only. Preserve ammo where possible." As Crowley and his men advanced on the floundering pack, some soldiers began calling they were out of ammo and were drawing their sidearms. With only a few of the creatures still standing, they were going to cut it close. Suddenly, one of the humanoid monstrosities reared up on 2 legs, its distorted, elongated body easily 7 feet from head to toe, with a shock of red hair and a face out of a nightmare, and turned and charged at its tormentors. "Look out!" Crowley yelled, and dived to his right, landing yards away from Rogers, who had raised the shotgun and fired. The blast took it in the shoulder, but the giant barely flinched as it continued its mad charge, right past them, and towards the civilians in the vehicles. "Take it down! Take it down!" They emptied their guns into the creature's back. It stumbled, but lumbered on as Crowley sprinted after it, his knife in hand. He was catching it, but realized it was futile. The creature would reach the vehicles before he could get to it. Suddenly the ram's engine roared, and it shot forward, speeding at the creature. It struck with an almighty bang, and the giant flew 20 feet into the air, tumbling head over heels before crashing back to earth head first. The meaty snap of its neck breaking was loud and clear, but Crowley didn't have time to process it as the ram, brakes locked, skidded towards him. Crowley dived to the right, just escaping the out-of-control truck, which careened into a ditch and stopped with a sudden, noisy impact. Crowley motioned to the others to finish the beast off, which laid gurgling on its back, twisted and malformed, and he ran to the ram. Billy was already out of his seat and cursing loudly as he inspected the popped tires and steaming front end. "Had to do it," he said, running his hand through his thinning hair. "God damn it." "I know," Crowley replied. "That's it?" asked Josephine.
approaching with a quick look at the dead creature.
Yeah, we are down to one vehicle. Women and children only. The rest of us will be walking from here on in.
Women and children? I'm happy to walk, Crowley. Children and those carrying injuries, male or female, should be in the Hummer. Don't you agree?
Crowley could have throttled Teddy, who had come up behind Josephine and was grinning at the mild rebuke. Sure, you're right. Care to organize it? He asked, studiously ignoring Thaddeus. 10 minutes later, they moved out, at a much slower pace than they had been setting with 2 vehicles, and only the soldiers on foot. Back in basic training, Thaddeus had been unfit, and was always last in exercises that involved running and carrying packs. Despite that, he endured and became one of the fittest in his squad, maintaining that status all the way up until the outbreak and their ill-fated mission. Now, as they moved on foot along the I-80, he just wanted to lay down and sleep for a week. Thankfully, cloud cover gave them respite from the sun, but the trek was exhausting nevertheless. "Know where we're headed?" Dan asked Teddy out of the blue. The two had rarely talked, not for any particular reason, except for the fact that they moved in different circles within the little group. Dan looked haggard and tired, and he was sweating profusely.
"We'll head north soon, judging by the signs. There will be something for Sioux Falls, which will be the next major city."
Dan scoffed at that.
"We can't make it in time, you know. It's days away if we're on foot."
I know.
"So what then? Why don't we just stop and—"
"You heard the captain. We're looking for vehicles, and while we're doing that, we keep moving."
Dan shook his head.
"Starting to think we should never have fallen in with you. All it's led to is death and misery."
Teddy, without thinking, had grabbed Dan by the upper arm and pulled him to a stop.
"If it wasn't for us, you'd have been dog food a long time ago. I get you're tired. We all are. But I swear, if you don't stop whining, you'll be left here by the side of the road to fend for yourself. Is that what you want? You and Maureen left out here all alone?"
Crowley and Josephine, who were walking silently together, paused and observed the interaction, but Crowley didn't intervene, trusting Teddy to handle it. Dan squirmed.
"No, hey, you're hurting me. You do want to come along, then?"
"Yes. Sorry, I'm just—"
The older man's voice trailed away into sobs, and Teddy, chastened, let him go.
"Sorry, Dan. Look, I know you're suffering. We all are. Let me get you some water, and let's look at getting you some miles in the Hummer."
The old man, barely able to speak, nodded, and Teddy motioned for the Hummer to stop. Maria, who had been cradling baby Ed, gladly swapped her place with Dan, who climbed in beside his wife, Maureen, clutching the half-empty water bottle Teddy had given him. His wife comforted him, and he sucked it up, telling her he was okay now. "Well handled, soldier," said Crowley when Teddy caught up with them.
"It nearly wasn't," said Teddy. "I nearly lost it."
"Well, you didn't, and that's what counts." 5. A half-hour later, Crowley was, to cheering and celebration, able to lead the group of survivors and his squad into a large gas station with a diner that had not been looted. There were no vehicles, unfortunately, but in the refrigerator of the diner they found plenty of water, and in the cupboards dried pasta and canned tomatoes that they managed to turn into a feast of sorts. It was a pleasant break from trudging along the highway. Reality came too soon, though, and with just 28 hours left, they took some extra supplies, enough to last them a few days, and continued north away from the interstate, along smaller country roads. On either side, as they roamed deeper into the state, they came across 3 discarded vehicles: a tractor, an old pickup, and a beaten-up van that looked like it had survived a war. Ignoring any fatigue, Teddy, Stiles, and company ran at the chance to investigate, and quickly found the truck and the van in working order, with modest amounts of fuel. The tractor was close to empty, and not practical anyway. Crowley rounded people up and loaded them in, their spirits soaring, and within 20 minutes they were back on the road and driving as fast as they safely could. Cornfields whipped by for miles, and after a few hours driving, just as the sun started to dip in the sky, the truck was the first to sputter and start to give out. Once it finally died, they squashed everyone into the van, just managing to ensure no one had to walk, and thus keeping up their good pace. It was hot and cramped, and Crowley was glad he was driving. Josephine sat next to him in the passenger seat with baby Ed in her arms. When the van also gave up the ghost, and without enough ammunition to defend and protect themselves and the civilians, they were back to square one, trudging along the open road behind the Hummer.
"Down to a quarter of a tank," Teddy whispered to Crowley.
The captain nodded, his face stony. The group moved on as, to the west, a beautiful sunset cast deep, burning oranges, purples, and reds across the sky, where clouds ran in lines across the horizon.
"Beautiful,"
Josephine whispered. They fell to silence again, their footsteps and the occasional bird the only sound to be heard for miles. It both unnerved and relaxed Crowley in equal and contradictory measure. On one hand, he was thankful for the lack of action, considering the vulnerable position they were in. Surely, though, it was only a matter of time before danger found them. Bristling, Crowley picked his pace up a little and motioned to the others. 24 hours, folks. We need to up the pace. Next town is 7 miles.
"They can't do another 2 or 3 hours walk, Crowley. Come on,"
Josephine protested, after jogging up to reach him.
"We need to find somewhere on the road to stop."
Stop? In that cornfield or this one? Crowley brandished his hands to either side of their long, unending strip of gray asphalt, to the endless cornfields that had run parallel with them for the last hour or more. Was it possible for a place to be flatter than Kansas?
"Real funny, Captain. But there'll be a farmhouse somewhere along here, so we need to take the first driveway we come across. If not, we should call it quits for the day and camp on the side of the road," Josephine said, before lowering her voice. "Look at Maureen and Dan, for Christ's sake, Crowley. Even Billy."
Sure enough, when he snuck a glance over his shoulder, he could see Billy way back with Teddy, where they walked in line with Dan and Maureen, who looked pained with each step they took. Crowley sighed. "You're right. We need to stop. I'll tell the group." Crowley stopped, waited for everyone to collect and group up on his point, and then clapped his hands together. Rogers looked dead on his feet. Carter was full of energy, it seemed, but everyone else looked ready to collapse, utterly beat. The lack of food and sleep for the past few days had finally caught up with them. "Okay, we're calling it. We are going to look for a farmhouse to stay overnight in, but if we don't, we take it to the grass by the cornfields, and we settle in for the night. In keeping with democracy, raise your hands if—" "Okay, then. Settled." Crowley didn't need to carry on, as everyone launched their hands in the air and continued their slow trudge when he gave the signal. Despite still carrying baby Ed, who had also been lucky with some powdered milk they'd found at the diner, Josephine was full of energy and vigor, and easily kept up with Crowley at the front. "How the hell are you so energetic?" he asked her. She shrugged.
"Just making the best of it, I guess."
A few minutes later, in the last of the dying light, she pointed ahead.
"Is that a letterbox?"
"I think it is. Well spotted." Then to the rest, "Pick up the pace, people. Looks like we found somewhere." Dropping back to motivate the others who were struggling the most, Crowley had Dustin and Stiles lead the way. They reached the gate, and their eyes followed the dirt track until it disappeared in the gloom. There was no sign of a farmhouse, but in the distance against the darkening sky there was a large, distinctively shaped structure.
"Looks like we might have to settle for a barn," Teddy opined.
"It'll do," said Crowley. "Come on, hustle these people. I don't like the look of those clouds." The barn was set in a yard with a rusting tractor and an old wheelless Ford F-100 on cinder blocks.
Damn,
Billy huffed, stretching and cracking his lower back as he eyed the Ford.
that looks about as old as I feel.
"Carter, Dustin, go around to the rear. I want everyone behind me ready in case we have any nasty business. Capiche?" His men nodded, and the others, held by Billy, stepped back to give them room to clear the large barn. Carter hurried to the left of the barn, checked around the corner, and vanished, his knife held ready. Dustin was almost completely in unison, taking the right and disappearing. Crowley counted 10, giving them time to get to the rear. When they didn't return or give a signal that there was trouble, Crowley assumed the best, and they readied to enter. Crowley pulled out his combat knife and held it blade forward, not wanting to waste a precious moment to switch it out and stab anything that might jump at him. In this stance, he could cause maximum damage immediately. Hand on the barn door latch, he gave one look at Stiles and Teddy behind him, and slowly eased the door open. Silence. A slow breeze rolled out from inside, bringing dust, mites, straw, and something else entirely. The smell of death. Stiles gagged, and Crowley put a hand to his mouth briefly to brace himself. It was a rancid smell, worse than he'd experienced in a long, long time. Edging through the opening, he looked to his left and right, then straight up, where the roof stretched up for a good 20 feet. He took another step. Crunch. Crowley briefly looked down under his boot and spotted something pale white in the dimness. It was a bone. Eyes back up and scanning his surroundings, he took in the bales of hay rotting in large stacks, the empty horse stalls and a forklift at the back with some older machinery. Satisfied for the moment, Crowley knelt to pick up the bone he'd just stepped on and held it up to Stiles just behind him. It was a human jawbone, with strings of flesh still attached. Stiles nodded, suitably impressed at the need for absolute vigilance. Knife still held out before him, Crowley moved further into the barn, followed by Teddy to his right and Stiles on his left. They took turns checking each stall and darkened corner. The barn seemed clear. There were no more body parts, and few clues as to what had happened to the unfortunate owner of the jawbone. Crowley shivered as he went further in and approached the forklift. The lifting mechanism was raised to waist height, and he ran his fingers along one of the prongs, making a line in the thick dust. In a past life, he'd once talked about living on the land, and felt a wave of sadness wash over him, thinking of all the farmers and their families who had once lived on the land and were now dead or in hiding, or worse. He turned back to give Stiles and Teddy the all-clear when a guttural bark jolted all three of them from their ease. Crowley immediately held up a hand. The barking came from the shadows behind the forklift, and the sound of a chain clanging against metal accompanied it. Crowley, wary and with knife ready, rounded the forklift. He saw the mutated mutt, small and mangy, and scrambling desperately to break free of the chain that anchored its collar to a hook in the concrete floor. For just a second, Crowley felt pity for it. Left alone and starving to turn, with no one to put it out of its misery. He could have left it too. There was no way it was getting off the thick chain, but Crowley did what was right. Carefully, he approached and pulled his last bite of jerky from the pocket on his trousers. "Hey, boy, you must be hungry." The dog growled low in its throat, and its lips peeled back from the nest of elongated fangs in its mouth. That's the boy. A face only a mother could love. Here. He tossed the jerky on the floor in front of the dog, and it lunged forward, attempting to grab the morsel between its unwieldy teeth. All it managed to do was push the jerky around, but it was distraction enough for Crowley to step in and, with a swift motion, slide the sharp knife deep into the side of its neck. Without a whimper, it fell quiet and slumped to the floor. Good boy, he said, and withdrew the knife, wiping it clean on the side of the dog's coat.
Cap?
Called Teddy. All clear. Carter and Dustin had met around back and entered through the rickety rear door.
Bolted, and I rolled a barrel up against it,
said Carter. Good work. Okay, let's get these people inside. Outside, Crowley gave an update to the civilians, who had been looked after by Billy and Josephine while they cleared the barn. Satisfied, and keen to bed for the night, they moved toward the old barn, the fatigue suddenly hitting them hard.
God damn,
Billy exclaimed, and pointed to the sky to the west.
That doesn't look too good.
Teddy followed his gaze and let out a whistle. Crowley looked up and saw a great mass of dark clouds stretching for miles along the horizon. True enough, a whip of wind caught them suddenly, sending dirt up into the air and creaking the barn door back into the front with a loud crack. A flash of lightning illuminated them, followed a few seconds later by a tremendous rumble. Crowley knew they didn't have much time, judging by the wind speed. He was about to give the order to head in when he caught sight of a lone figure, a man, hunched over on all fours, staring at him from the edge of the cornfield with large, silvery eyes. It must have been drawn by the barking. Inside the barn, now. Teddy, do a quick search for weapons. If we're lucky, there might be a rifle or a shotgun in there, but anything, even a pitchfork or axe, will help. Crowley turned back to the figure. Others appeared beside it. First one, then 2, 3, eventually 5 more, still and disconcertingly quiet as they looked at him with the same strange, silvery eyes. These specimens chilled him more than the frenetic, mindless freaks that they'd encountered before. Without breaking eye contact, he slowly backed into the barn before pulling the door closed and latching its heavy iron bolt. He didn't know if they were now trapped or safe, but they would find out soon enough. 6.
I found a stash,
Billy called down from the loft. Crowley was surprised when Billy appeared holding a long gun, which he duly dropped into Crowley's waiting hands. The ghost of a smile flashed across Crowley's stubbled face. A Remington 870 shotgun, as common in the States as Twinkies, Ford pickups, and Golden Arches. Not the sexiest firearm, but you couldn't beat its reliability, and Crowley had fired a few of these in his youth. The stock and forestock were a worn, flaking walnut, which had no doubt seen a beautiful, smooth finish once upon a time. Crowley used a freshly lit lamp they'd found to inspect the action bar, making sure it wasn't loaded and checking that it pumped clean. It did. Billy called out and tossed down 2 more long guns, both beaten-up old hunting rifles, which Carter and Stiles caught, followed by 2 half-empty boxes. One contained shells for the 870, and the other for the rifles.
That's it. It'll have to do,
Billy panted as he climbed down the ladder. It's better than I had hoped for, said Crowley, before scanning the civilians in the dim light. Josephine, can you help Billy get everybody up into the loft?
Sure. Let's go, people. You heard the captain.
Stiles had split the 30-30 rounds with Carter, and they were both busy checking and loading the 2 hunting rifles. Teddy was peering through the grimy front window, gripping his knife.
We'll need to bottleneck them if we can, then let them have it.
Crowley nodded in agreement and carefully placed the shells in his left shirt pocket. He then proceeded to load them, one by one, feeling a hint of disappointment when he realized that the tube could only hold 4 shells, plus the one in the chamber. That left 2 in his pocket to fumble for if he ran out before the danger was neutralized. A flash of lightning illuminated the barn, and everyone went quiet. Not a breath, not a creak. A second later, there was a loud clap of thunder, and the roaring wind picked up as heavy rain began to pelt the old barn. Through the noise outside, they heard a shriek, and Crowley knew time was up. He patted the 2 extra shells in his pocket and marched over to Teddy to peer through the window. He couldn't see a damn thing. "Let's shutter this," he said, pulling the interior timber shutter closed, and with Teddy's help latching the distorted shutter. Stiles came up behind them and used a hammer to nail a short plank to the frame to bolster it. Crowley nodded, satisfied that it would hold, and walked back and looked up at the loft. Through a gap in the floorboards, he could see the civilians huddled in the far corner, furthest from the ladder, with Billy at the edge, the Desert Eagle Crowley had allocated to him days before in hand, standing between them and anything that might come up the ladder. When they came, it was the door at the back of the barn that banged and rattled as it was assaulted. Why they hadn't come through the front, he didn't know. Maybe they'd smelled the blood of the dead canine. 2 things struck him. The back door was the weakest point of access, but it would also serve as the bottleneck Teddy had mentioned. "Form up," Crowley called urgently, waving Stiles and Carter to the front. The old door bulged under the weight of whatever was trying to get in. Crowley, next to Carter and Stiles, leveled the shotgun to the doors, while Teddy and the other soldiers, along with Rogers and Dougie, hovered midway, ready to help if needed, and armed with knives and any other implements they thought would be useful. The door wobbled again. The roaring and screeching of the creatures blended with the rain and thunder hammering the old barn. The noise was almost deafening, and it was all Crowley could do to make his voice heard over the cacophony. "Steady." Finally, the plank door splintered, and part of it broke away as horrible mottled and clawed hands reached in, ripping the hole wider. There were screams of fear from the loft, and, illuminated by another flash of lightning, the gray face of a rabid humanoid with a grotesquely misshapen mouth forced its way through the jagged hole. Crowley stepped toward and pumped his .870, blowing its head clean off. Suddenly the door crashed in, and multiple forms with spindly limbs and gnashing teeth burst through. Crowley, Carter, and Stiles all opened fire. They were keeping it under control, although some of the creatures required several rounds to bring down, when several dogs followed them in. Crowley and the others fell back to some of the bales of hay they'd positioned in case of this exact situation. Crowley took 2 dogs out with 2 shots, while Carter and Stiles took down 2 more. That was it. No more poured through the door, and the bodies that lay twitching on the floor of the barn were no threat. "Good work, people," Crowley said, and stepped forward to inspect the downed creatures. Suddenly, a 2-legged creature with a gaping hole in its left shoulder sprung from the carnage and darted towards a stall to the right. Carter and Stiles both took shots but missed the creature, who was weaving and ducking. Crowley took another shot and missed, and without warning the humanoid horror changed directions and ran straight for him. He was empty and fumbled for the shells in his pocket while fully aware that he wouldn't reload in time. "Captain!" someone screamed. Crowley flipped the shotgun and gripped the barrel, raising it like Babe Ruth at the plate. "Get down, Cap!" Stiles yelled, but Crowley was committed. As the creature, with its big, hungry, golem-like eyes, came into range, he swung the shotgun with all his might. The heavy stock struck the side of the creature's head with a sickening crunch, and Crowley stepped aside as it fell to the floor, skidding past him before coming to rest in a bleeding heap. Crowley leaned on the empty shotgun, panting as his men came forward and clapped him on the back. The captain smiled. Finally, they'd managed to fight off a danger without the loss of life. "All right. He was interrupted by the sound of a bolt being undone, and turned to see Rogers at the big doorway, poking his head outside into the rain. "Rogers, shut the goddamn door." Rogers looked over his shoulder.
Just thought it'd be a good idea to check there's nothing else out there, Captain.
"No," he said. "That door's secure. Come help us get this rear one barricaded." Rogers shrugged.
Okay,
he said, as a flash of lightning silhouetted him and revealed a tall, sinister figure behind him. 7. The shape behind Rogers was another of the humanoid creatures, this one towering at least 7 feet. "Watch out!" Crowley screamed. Too late. The desecrated, fang-lined hole where its mouth had once been opened unnaturally wide, and its big spatula-like fingers grabbed the now screaming man by the shoulders, lifted him, and bit down on his head. Roger's head burst like an overripe grape squeezed in a vice, and shrieks of horror erupted behind. Crowley, without taking his eyes from the horror in front of him, snapped the shotgun open and loaded his last 2 shells. There was no panic this time. The creature was intent on its gory meal. Crowley marched forward 3 steps. The creature dropped Rogers, his head missing from the bridge of his nose up, and turned its big moon eyes on Crowley as it used its right hand to push the meal further into its maw. Crowley didn't hesitate. With a roar, he darted forward, pushed the barrel into the creature's mouth, and pulled the trigger. Its head evaporated in a cloud of pink, and its headless body collapsed to the ground.
Rogers, you dumb bastard,
whispered Teddy, coming up behind him.
I wonder why it didn't attack you.
I think we gave them too much credit. They aren't organized or intelligent at all. At least these ones weren't. Just dumb eating machines. He was interrupted by a hoarse scream.
Rogers!
The kid came running for his deceased friend, and Crowley grabbed him, pulling him into a bear hug and turning him away from the horrid sight. "He's gone, Dougie. Sorry. You don't want to get any closer." Dougie struggled to break free, and Crowley, surprised at the skinny kid's strength, only just managed to hold on to him. "Shh, Dougie." Finally, he stopped struggling and broke into sobs, his body heaving against Crowley as Josephine appeared with an old blanket, which she draped over Roger's body. "Teddy, get that door shut," said Crowley, as Josephine peeled Dougie away and led him to where the others huddled. Crowley went to work with his men to secure the barn once again. By the time they were done, the noise of the storm was muffled once more. Dougie took the death of his last comrade hard, and it took the best efforts of Josephine and Maria to quieten him down. His cries, mingled with the fury of the storm, made for a long night. By morning the storm had cleared, and the barn was unscathed, aside from puddles caused by a few leaks in the roof. Dougie had not slept until a few hours before dawn, according to Maureen, who'd taken over comforting him while Josephine and Maria got some sleep. "Let him sleep until just before we leave," ordered Crowley, as he led his men out to reconnoiter the area. After confirming that there were no nasty surprises lying in wait, Teddy and 2 other men dug a grave for Rogers. It was Teddy's idea. He thought it would help give Dougie closure. Crowley had agreed, and while they were working, he set a campfire to cook the last of their tinned supplies. This would be their last-ditch effort to reach the safe haven, and he wanted nothing left in reserves. The men made quick work of digging the grave out by the cornfields, the ground softened by the heavy rain the night before. Once everyone had their fill of warm beans and canned potatoes, Crowley asked Josephine to wake Dougie up. Meanwhile, he helped Teddy wrap Roger's body tightly in the blanket. Surprisingly, the kid was dry-eyed as he helped carry his friend out to the grave. Crowley watched as Teddy and Dougie lowered the body into the hole and quickly filled it in. As Teddy recited the Lord's Prayer, Dougie reached into his shirt and pulled out a crucifix, which he removed from around his neck and kissed before laying it at the head of the grave.
"Nice touch, kid,"
said Teddy when he was finished, patting Dougie's shoulder.
"He would have insisted,"
Dougie said.
"Catholic born and raised."
"I get that. For what it's worth, I know I was a little harsh to him sometimes, but no matter what happened with your old crew at the prison, you both had our backs when you came over. You guys made the choice to do the right thing, and that's what defines us in the end."
Dougie nodded, unable to speak. Heading back to the barn, Crowley spotted Teddy pushing the Desert Eagle he'd given Rogers back into his side holster. "Think that it's cursed?" he asked. Teddy looked saddened, but shook his head.
"No, just us."
"Sure feels that way," Crowley sighed, hooking his thumbs into his belt loops and looking back at Rogers' grave. He had felt sure that this time he could keep everyone safe. But once more, he had let another life slip into the dirt. "Might just be me."
"I've wondered that,"
Teddy smirked.
"Maybe it's time I took over, eh?"
"Asshole."
"Too soon?"
Crowley shook his head. "You think?" Once the campfire was cleared and their packs readied, they followed the road that brought them here the day before, the rest of them once again trudging behind the Hummer, which surely couldn't last too much longer after they reached the road proper. The asphalt looked black, still slick from the rain. It stretched out for miles more, and on the thought of distance and time, Crowley looked at his watch just as Josephine appeared at his side, a hand on his back for comfort.
"How long do we have left?"
she said. "A little over 12 hours.
"Shit."
"Yeah." Teddy appeared from nowhere and thumped Crowley on the shoulder, overtaking him. He turned and grinned, winking at Josephine.
"Don't worry. Just because we're cursed doesn't mean we give up just yet, right, Billy? We've been through some shit, you and I. Think we can get through this? Come on, let's pick up the pace."
"Don't try your gladiator pep talk on me, kid. I'm too tired, and you ain't no Russell Crowe,"
Billy yelled from the back. This elicited some much-needed laughter from the entire group, but it seemed to have the effect the sergeant was after, and everyone's pace picked up.
"He's right, you know,"
Josephine said once Teddy had jogged back into line.
"We haven't given up yet."
Crowley looked back at Emily walking with Maria, holding her hand while Maureen had taken her turn to carry Ed. If there was one single purpose to keep going, it was for them. We sure as hell haven't. 8. The journey along the road had taken its toll on Crowley as much as anyone, causing him to struggle with maintaining his balance. Days of meager rations and scarce water had made survival even more challenging for the civilians accompanying him. The sky was still overcast after last night's storm, offering a brief cooling off as rain drenched them to the bone before abruptly ceasing. Crowley despised the chafing of his pants and wondered how raw his skin would become by the time they secured transportation.
"Will we stop at the next town?"
Maria asked, her dark hair still dripping from the rain as Crowley approached the front of the group. "Yeah," he replied, glancing at his watch. "Time is running out. We need to dry off, find supplies to sustain us, and replenish our ammunition."
"You guys have completely run out?"
Maria's shocked expression revealed her diminished sense of security, however small it may have been. "We have," Crowley confirmed.
"What happens if more of them find us?"
"We run," Teddy called from behind, wearing a dark smile that he wiped off when Crowley turned to glare at him.
"We'll be okay. The cover of the next town will give us an advantage, and we're still armed for close combat."
Crowley studied Maria, who gazed ahead at the long, straight road. She didn't seem entirely convinced, and he saw an involuntary shiver go up her spine. We'll be fine. Just a little farther, I promise," Crowley reassured her, though deep down it was as much for himself. Each passing day, each passing hour, eroded his self-belief as an army captain in a way he had never experienced before. It would take every ounce of his resolve to keep his head held high and maintain a positive outlook. As the sun began to peek through the clouds, casting patches of bright green on the fields, it was already late morning. In the distance, they spotted a sign for Casey's, with a towering water tank behind it. One of the men from the back let out a low whistle.
"God damn, I love me a Casey's,"
Carter exclaimed. Crowley raised an eyebrow. "Do I dare ask?"
"It's the best grab-and-go pizza on this side of the States, without a doubt," Carter declared.
This sparked groans from the group, including Teddy, who staunchly defended the superiority of 7-Eleven. The conversation devolved into childish laughter when Dan suggested that Come and Go was the superior chain, a notion Crowley disagreed with. Though he supported Teddy's argument, he couldn't really care less about the origin of his $2 hot dogs or pizza. They weren't talking gourmet cuisine. Once the chatter subsided, Casey's became clearly visible, prompting Crowley to direct Dustin and Stiles to the left, and Dougie and Carter to the right. He and Teddy slowly guided the group toward the gas station outside the Casey's building, their eyes vigilant for any signs of movement. As they advanced along the road, Crowley's gaze shifted upward to the water tower, adorned with a prominent decal that read, "Home of the Vikings." Unable to detect any threats, he shifted his attention to the store, checking the windows, trash cans, and the sidewalk leading into the town proper. Crowley signaled his men to flank both sides, and when they emerged from their positions, standing with their arms at their sides, he already knew the coast was clear. With a gesture to Teddy, he instructed the others to wait while they explored the store. Crouching by the door, Crowley peered inside and slowly pushed it open. The shelves were almost bare, save for a few trinkets, magazines, packets of gum, and empty soda bottles scattered about. Crowley ventured down the first aisle, with Teddy silently trailing behind, following the adjacent aisle toward the cash register. They kept their ears attuned to any sound, a breath, a shuffle of feet. But as they reached the cooler fridges and the fire exit at the back, their search yielded no results. Nodding toward the door behind Teddy, the office, and supplies, Crowley silently communicated their next move. Teddy acknowledged the signal, turned, and cautiously approached the door, with Crowley covering his back. Their knives were drawn in perfect synchronization, readying themselves for a potential melee on the other side. Teddy gripped the doorknob with his left hand, knife raised in his right. Locking eyes with Crowley, he awaited the order, unwavering and focused. Crowley nodded, and Teddy swung the door open. Empty. A sigh of relief escaped Crowley's lips as he conducted a final sweep of the store's back area before returning to the forecourt, where everyone had been waiting. As he made his way toward the civilians, he noticed Maureen sway on her feet and begin to collapse. If not for Dan's quick reflexes, her head would have struck the concrete with a sickening crack.
"Jesus!"
Dan exclaimed, cradling her in his arms. Josephine swiftly knelt down, checking Maureen's pulse, while Crowley stood over them, momentarily helpless.
"Her pulse is a bit rapid. She's dehydrated. We need to get her inside and find water as soon as possible,"
Josephine informed Crowley. "Right, on it," he said, and dashed into the store. He ran down the aisles, scanning for water bottles, but they must have been cleared out by other survivors. He found an empty plastic bottle, which he took into the store's public bathroom. He held his breath as he turned the faucet. After a moment, water sputtered out, and he exhaled, quickly filling the bottle. He then carried it back outside and handed it to Josephine, who slowly fed the water to the now conscious Maureen.
"Easy,"
Josephine said, cautioning Maureen as she coughed while gulping down the water. Crowley anxiously chewed the insides of his cheeks. They had no way of knowing how clean the water was, but it was a gamble they had to take. They couldn't risk an open fire to boil the water, not when they were out of ammo. He cursed silently, wishing they still had a portable gas cooker with them. They helped Maureen to her feet and guided her into the store. Crowley and his squad rearranged the shelving to create cover near the windows, and then cleared space in the center of the store for the civilians to rest. In the meantime, Crowley instructed Teddy to take a few men to search for any useful items or medical supplies left in the store. Checking his watch as Maureen settled in, Crowley noticed that Emily had found half a packet of snack-sized Mars bars hidden beneath the cash register area, and watched as she shared them with the other children after chucking one over to Josephine to give to Maureen. When she caught him watching, her chocolate-coated lips curled into a smile, and he gave her a thumbs up. It was half an hour before midday, leaving them with a 7-hour window to reach the safe haven. If they were to have any chance of survival, they needed to find 2 functional vehicles or a bus or something, and quickly. But before that, he had to ensure the group had something to replenish their energy and quench their thirst. They were worn out. Standing sentry by the door, Crowley observed as everyone shared the tap water from reused bottles and distributed more rationed candy bars they had stumbled upon. Teddy approached triumphantly, having discovered beef jerky and more tinned peaches.
I swear to God,
Billy cursed.
if I eat another peach as long as I live, I'll turn into one. God damn.
Well, you're welcome, said Teddy sarcastically.
This interaction greatly amused Emily, who was perhaps on a sugar high, who set off a contagious fit of giggles that spread through the group like wildfire. Even Crowley found himself smiling. Then he mentally formulated their next steps. Soon they would need to split into small groups and scour the small town for gasoline and working vehicles. Hopefully they'd have better luck here.
Here you go,
Josephine said, nudging Crowley out of his reverie, offering him a quarter of a Snickers bar, a piece of beef jerky, and the last sips from a bottle of water.
Bon appetit, Captain.
Thanks, he said, and patted his pocket with his free hand. Sorry I don't have enough for a tip. They both laughed. Well, hate to grab and go, but...
You should sit down for 10 minutes too, Crowley,
Josephine said. No, I'm good.
Ed, I saw you swaying. You can't just look after everyone else and neglect yourself.
Why can't I? I'm the captain.
Yeah, but that doesn't make you invincible. I'm not asking you to take a nap. Just sit while you have that food and drink,
Josephine insisted. We don't have time for me to rest, Crowley persisted. We're coming up to 7 hours until we miss our entry to Sioux Falls. I can't stop. And I won't until every person in this store is there, safe, especially you and the kids. He didn't hold back anymore and voiced the words he had kept inside. Josephine's face briefly reddened, but she turned away, hands in her pockets, before facing Crowley again, as if she had found the right words to say.
Well, I prefer it if you didn't run yourself into an early grave. I want you to enjoy the safety there, too.
They stared at each other for a few seconds. He opened his mouth to speak.
10 minutes,
Josephine said, before he could protest again, her voice determined.
Sit, eat, drink, and rest up. If there's a truck or two with our name on it, they aren't going anywhere. This town is empty.
Fine. I guess 10 minutes won't hurt. Josephine meant well, and she was probably right about the 10 minutes, so he decided to take the small respite. Josephine smiled, relieved that he had seen sense. She reached out and squeezed his upper arm.
Just promise me you'll take care of yourself.
Then, more quietly, she said,
I don't want safety if you're not there with me.
Crowley put a hand over hers. I will. I promise. Leaving Crowley to his brief rest, Josephine turned to assist the others, ensuring everyone had something to eat and drink. It was a small pause amidst the chaos, but perhaps it would provide them with the strength they needed to face the challenges ahead. The food went down quicker and easier than Crowley anticipated, and with little else to go around, he half regretted wolfing it down without savoring it a little more. As a poor substitute, he drank the last of his water, then refilled at the sink and stood up front, refreshed and ready to get moving. "Okay, attention all," he said, and clapped his hands together just as Carter and Stiles came back inside from a brief recon. "We need to move forward with obtaining transport. Maureen, how are you feeling?" She nodded.
"Much better. I'm sorry I took the fall back there."
"No need to apologize. You'll rest here with some of the others. I'll take some of my guys out, and we will split into 3 groups. One here in Casey's, one searching the north and northwest area of town, the last group to search for the east and southeast."
"What if we don't find anything?"
Dan asked. "That is a potential reality we face. And if so, we have to accept that we won't make the safe haven," Crowley replied matter-of-factly. There was no use lying to them. Murmurs stirred the group, and Billy stood up.
"Horseshit. There's got to be something in this shitty town. Let me go too. I'll find something."
"Easy, Billy. We still have one shot, but I just need everyone to realize and accept this will be our last. If we don't get lucky here, we need to recalibrate and think of an alternative long-term plan. All right?" They didn't look happy about the possibility of not reaching Sioux Falls by the time it was locked down, but they also seemed to understand there was only a slim chance they'd win their race against the clock. "Good. Stiles, you stay here with the kids, Maureen, and Dan."
"Yes, Captain."
"Next, I want Dustin, Dougie, Teddy, and Maria to take the south and east side of town. The rest of us, myself, Billy, Josephine, and Carter, will take the west and north sides."
"Leaving them a bit thin, Captain?"
Dustin said, gesturing to the elder folk and the kids. "I am. It's a gamble, but we need as many of us out there searching for vehicles. Are you up to this, Stiles?" He nodded.
"I am. They'll be safe. We've got a good barricade here if the worst happens."
"Good. Keep it barricaded until one of us gets back, okay?" Crowley commanded. Stiles nodded, and that left Dustin to shrug and shove his hands behind his back. "Okay," Crowley boomed and stood up straight. "Let's roll." 9. As Teddy and his group rounded their first block at the beginning of their search, the conversation of the others still within earshot, his watch read noon on the dot and reminded him they didn't have long. He couldn't help but sense the urgency and unease of the civilians, an unease that might turn to panic before long. For as long as Teddy could remember, he had always held Crowley in high regard. As far as captains go, hell, as far as friends go, he was the real deal. And so, right when it really mattered, when he was clearly struggling under the enormous guilt of losing several of the group, Teddy didn't want to let him down. He wanted to bring home a win.
"We checked the garages, too,"
Teddy told the others.
"We don't have bolt cutters, so we'll get creative if we have to."
Maria was looking left and right, checking the driveways and down the sides of houses, which sat on wide plots with plenty of space between each neighbor. She recalled her brief time in New York and couldn't imagine trading such luxury and space for a few square feet, crammed in tight with everyone else.
"I don't see much at all. Look."
Teddy followed her outstretched hand, which pointed to an open garage, completely looted, and with skid marks leading out down the driveway to the road.
"We just keep looking," Teddy said. "It'll be a miracle if we find one," she persisted. "Two? I just think we need to realize this safe haven run is a bust."
Dougie and Dustin looked at him expectantly.
"Great," Teddy said, throwing up his arms theatrically. "Why don't we just give up now? Just lay in the middle of the road and wait for whatever rabid piece of shit comes along to eat us, huh? That's not what
Maria started.
That's right. None of us want that, so we keep on going,
Teddy said through gritted teeth, his jaw clenched. He knew Maria was just feeling the strain, as they all were. But it angered him to hear his own worries voiced out loud and made real. Deep down, he knew that if he allowed himself, he'd consider throwing in the towel. They fell into an awkward silence as they inspected a few of the garages they had managed to open, finding nothing but lawnmowers and old bikes. Teddy made a joke about hauling ass to Sioux Falls on a pink girl's bicycle, complete with streamers hanging from the handle, and sending a ride back for them. It served to relieve some of the tension from the exchange of words with Maria earlier. 5 minutes in, they spotted an 80s model Volkswagen Beetle. The sight of it drew a grunt of excitement from Dustin, but closer inspection revealed it to be devoid of an engine and seats.
God damn,
Dustin said, running his hand over the roof.
I'd have killed for this back in the day. Would have taken it back to my shop and cleaned it up nice. New fitted seats, paint and polish, replacement engine.
Teddy laughed.
Love your automobiles, don't you? Yeah. I had just finished up fixing up a 1972 40Z on my last R&R. Shame I won't ever get to use it.
Teddy put an arm around his shoulders.
Don't worry, son. Pretty sure there are more cars in your future.
They moved on, but it was thin pickings. Houses abandoned. Vehicles gone.
Do you think, given this town is close to Sioux Falls, they packed up and headed for it when they heard the transmission?
Dougie asked.
I reckon there's a good chance that's what happened,
said Teddy, his hope dwindling with every vacant driveway they passed.
It makes sense,
agreed Maria. After 15 minutes, they saw a large house with a detached double garage in the distance.
Hold the phone,
said Teddy, and took off at a run. Dustin and Dougie followed right on his heels. Maria smiled at their enthusiasm, but had no intention of wasting valuable energy running after them. Teddy yanked at the left-hand door, but it didn't budge. He was about to begin the hunt for something to use to bust in when Dustin arrived and went straight to the other door. It went up with a beautiful cluttering sound, and Dougie whooped when he saw what was inside. Jackpot.
Oh, you found one! Well done,
said Maria as she arrived at the driveway. Behind the left-hand door was a big old F-100 with powder blue paintwork and an extended flatbed that looked too long to be legal. Dustin whistled and began a quick inspection of the wheels and tires while Teddy unlocked the other door and pulled it up from the inside. As the daylight fell into the space, Dustin grinned and rubbed his hand over the polished timber boards on the flatbed.
This thing is mint.
Finally,
Teddy said, then held his breath as Dustin opened the driver's side door. No key in the ignition. Before he could let rip with a litany of expletives, the young soldier pulled the sun visor down and caught the set of keys in his right hand before turning and grinning at Teddy.
Yes.
Okay, Dustin, check her over and see if you can get her started. Dougie and I will do a quick recon for food or drink in the house. Maria, can you please check the rest of the garage for anything you think might come in handy?
Teddy and Dougie went through the interior door into the main house, floorboards creaking underfoot as they entered a hallway with walls that were painted purple. Teddy looked over at Dougie, who was grimacing.
You okay, son?
Yeah, but who would paint their house this color?
Maybe Barney the dinosaur?
Teddy said, grinning at him. He was greeted with a puzzled stare.
Who?
Never mind, kid. Before your time, but trust me, he would have loved it.
Crowley and his group, who were checking the northwest side of town, had little luck. Apart from a Tesla for which they were unable to locate keys, they had come up empty-handed so far.
What's so funny?
Josephine asked when she spotted Crowley smiling. Oh, I was thinking we probably wasted 10 minutes looking for a key to a Tesla that I'm 99% sure had no charge. We need to check the garage there. And that truck, see it? Crowley pointed and gave Billy a grunt, heading towards the truck with Carter, who ran to catch up to him. Crowley and Josephine took the garage. The door was wide, but had been buckled by some force from inside. The fold in the bent aluminum allowed him to peek inside. Empty. Crowley walked back down the drive, frustration biting. He kicked at a plant pot, sending it a good 12 feet across the lawn, where it smashed against an ornamental fountain. He cocked his head and looked up and down the street, knowing that too much noise might attract unwanted attention.
We still have a half-dozen or so blocks to try,
Josephine reasoned, rubbing her dirtied hands down her jeans and adjusting the band in her hair.
Odds are still with us, I think.
You think? He snapped.
Yeah, you should try it sometime,
she clapped back. Crowley grinned. Touché. Josephine gazed at the home, a neat white bungalow, a wistful look on her face.
Ever pictured yourself living in something like this?
Josephine asked. Didn't we all? She shrugged.
Maybe.
You okay?
I guess I'm just dwelling on the past. You know, what might have been.
She gestured wide and turned on the spot.
But here we are, running for our lives in a place where people were living there happily ever after just a few months ago.
Nothing wrong with dwelling. But we have to keep our eyes on reality, no matter how nasty it looks.
I know.
Josephine sighed.
Oh, Carter's waving. Maybe we've gotten lucky?
Crowley looked and saw Carter gesturing to them. The pair jogged across the road and jumped over a waist-high picket fence and across the lawn to the driveway that went right through to the backyard.
We might have something, Carter said. But I'm not Dustin, so I don't know if it'll go. It's got some gas. We checked. But it's not ticking over. No sound. Look.
Carter jumped into the seat and turned the ignition. Nothing. Billy opened the hood and cursed up a storm.
All the damned wiring is gone. Ripped out. We got nothing.
Crowley could see Billy was about to lose it, so he put a hand on his arm. Not nothing, Billy, he said. You said it had gas, right? Carter had climbed out from the truck.
Yeah, I'll find a jerry can, or something we can use as a container.
Great, get to it. Josephine and I will search the garage and the house, see if we can find a hose of some sort. Billy, keep watch.
On it.
Crowley and Josephine found 2 yards of clear plastic tubing in the laundry room. It was rolled and hanging on a nail as if it had been left for them. When they returned to the truck, Carter was busily unscrewing the sprinkling head off a 2.5-gallon plastic watering can. This should work to hold the gas for a time. You get siphoning. We'll check the next-door garage. Billy is taking the other side of the street. Catch up when you're done.
Yes, sir.
Crowley and Josephine headed up through the front door of the house next door after discovering the heavy garage door locked and bolted. Crowley cracked the glass panel beside the door and reached in carefully to unlock it. Down a short hallway stood a kitchen. The door will be in there.
You go. I need to use the bathroom. I'm busting.
Okay. Now that she had mentioned using the bathroom, Crowley suddenly had the urge himself. He went through to the kitchen. The solid door to the garage was locked with a cylinder deadbolt, and he began rummaging through the drawers for something to use to break it open. He found a meat tenderizer mallet and hefted it in his hand. You'll do nicely. He was walking back to the door when he spied a handwritten note on the counter, weighed down by a .45 caliber bullet. Crowley picked it up and read the note. Beth, if you read this, don't wait. Head north to Sioux Falls. Shoot any dog you see. Stay safe. I love you. XX. Paul. Crowley pocketed the single bullet. He wondered briefly why Paul didn't wait for Beth, and if she made it on her own. On reflex, he checked his watch and saw the time had rolled on right past 1 in the afternoon. Less than 6 hours left.
Hey, everything all right?
Yeah. I found a note from the folk who lived here. Crowley handed her the note. Josephine let out a low whistle.
Shit. Hope they made it.
Yeah, no idea when it was written. Could have been at the start of the fall or a week ago. Either way, I'm inclined to subscribe to their philosophy and get moving. He strode to the door, and with 2 strikes of the metal mallet, he had it open. The garage was empty. Deflated, they left the house. Carter was screwing the sprinkler head back onto the watering can, but Billy was nowhere to be seen. Carter pointed down the street to where Billy stood staring at the front of a house, hands on hips.
He wanted to go off and look on his own, Carter said. Told him no can do, but he wouldn't listen.
Crowley grunted and stalked down the driveway and down the street towards Billy. We are under no circumstances splitting up to go solo on a wild hunt. I need you to know that before I turn my back and find another of this group has vanished. Clear?
We're wasting time like this, the older man said. We should split up. We'd be able to cover more ground.
No, not while I'm in charge. Billy shook his head, clearly unhappy. Crowley clapped him on the shoulder. Listen, we've got gas. The other group may have found a vehicle. With a little luck, we'll be in Sioux Falls by sunset, sipping on ice-cold buds.
I'll hold you to that. Buds. Not that Bud Light shit.
Crowley laughed. You got it. 10. Across the next few blocks, Billy's good mood dissipated, and his grumbling began to get on Crowley's nerves. He began to think that if it went on too much longer, Crowley would have to accept Teddy's wrath by beating the crap out of his new best friend. Perhaps sensing his slow burn, Josephine grasped his hand, and it worked to calm his fires a little. Now was no time to lose his shit. It was 2 p.m. The sun had already started to dip. A cooler breeze rolled through the neighborhood, bringing the smell of grass and the moist, nitrate-rich earth from the storm the night before. Crowley loved that smell. A half-dozen more homes, garages and side roads, gave them nothing. All their team had to show for it was the watering can Carter still swung at his side, holding maybe 1.5 gallons of gas at the most. Carter grumbled, peeking into their 100th garage to find it, too, was empty.
I'm beginning to think everyone took anything worth taking, Captain. What's the time? Do we have time to try elsewhere?
Crowley shook his head. No, we have just 5 hours left, so whatever we find has to be here or it's game over. Carter pointed to a particularly large house on the corner of 2 streets that merged at the end of the block they were on. A pair of large oak trees stood tall in the front yard. Next to it, a timber garage. Let's take a look. Crowley led them across the road, his eyes still scanning regularly to check for danger. He pointed to Billy and Carter to give the garage doors a workover. Josephine and I will take the house, see what they have. Big place. Billy grunted, already yanking at the peeling garage tilt door before Crowley and Josephine had crossed the front porch. Crowley tried the front door. The knob turned, and he pushed the door open before reeling back and coughing. Jesus, he said. Smell that? Josephine, who stood a few paces behind him, hadn't made a choking noise, so he assumed she'd gotten off easy. He turned and allowed her room to lean in and take a sniff. Her nose wrinkled.
My God, she said. What is that?
Crowley knew. You tend to never forget that kind of odor, especially having done a few tours. Dead body. Or bodies. We should take it slow, in case whatever put them down is still here with us. Hey, Carter, Crowley said quietly, leaning over the side of the porch. Dead inside. Reeks. Keep an eye out, got it?
Yes, Captain.
Satisfied, Crowley took out his knife and motioned for Josephine to wait at the door until he had cleared the hall and rooms on either side. He ventured in, checked behind the furniture, and found nothing. The only thing out of the ordinary to him was how clean it was, spotless, as if it had been tidied recently. Crowley motioned to Josephine. "All clear in here, but we need to check upstairs and—" He opened a side door which had stairs leading down. The basement.
"Oh, I can leave that to you. I'll take upstairs."
"Not on my watch."
"You know damn well I can take care of myself. If it makes you feel better, look."
Josephine stepped through the open-plan dining room to the kitchen, where a knife block stood fully stocked. She took one of the larger blades and smiled at him.
"See? Prepared."
Crowley blinked. "Fine. We would have heard something by now. Just be careful, and if you see anything, shout and get back to the front yard. Don't wait for me. Got it?"
"Got it, Captain."
Josephine headed up the stairs, and Crowley began down the steps into a dark, damp basement, where the smell seemed to be getting worse. By the time he reached the bottom, he pulled out his flashlight, which blinked and flickered on the last of its battery life, and cast it around in a wide arc to get his bearings. It was then that he realized there was a trail of blood leading from the staircase deep into the large basement. It was almost black, meaning it was fairly old, and he didn't feel an impending sense of danger, just a horrible sense of the inevitable as the stench became worse. Piles of boxes loomed in the dark, metal shelving, some chairs covered in tarp, and a few tires. Tires. Hopefully that boded well for the boys looking in the garage. Turning the flashlight to his right, following the rancid smell, he grew convinced whatever it was deep at the back of the basement. "Why do I volunteer for this shit?" he muttered to himself, trying to breathe through his mouth. The trail of blood wended its way between piles of boxes, and he followed it to its inevitable termination point. When he finally set eyes upon the source of the stench, it was worse, much worse, than he had expected, and he retched a couple of times before regaining control of his natural reflex. In a jumbled pile of torn and bloodied limbs, the corpses of long decomposed bodies lay against the north basement wall, the floor all around them stained dark, their ghoulish, pale skin illuminated by the flashlight. This close, the smell was almost impossible to cope with. Nothing about the scene led him to believe that dogs or any other animals had done this. The limbs had been hacked by a large blade of some sort, meaning one thing. The predator was human, and possibly not infected, although there was no way to tell how the virus had presented. Turning to leave, the light illuminated another wall, and Crowley stopped dead, the hair on the back of his neck standing on end. It was writing, daubed on the whitewashed concrete, in blood. He couldn't make out any of the letters or symbols, but it wasn't English or any other language he recognized. But it also didn't look like it was just scribble. It was ordered and deliberate, and looked as though it had meant something to whoever or whatever had scrawled it. Something clattered to his right, and he spun, knife out, and heart trying to jump out of his chest. The torchlight fell on an empty paint can, which had fallen from a shelf and rolled to one side. He kicked it hard to release some of the tension. Then, letting out a low breath, Crowley made a mental note to keep whatever this was to himself. The civilians didn't need the potential threat of a deranged rabid or not-so-rabid psycho-killer on the loose nearby to increase their anxiety. Crowley flashed his light over the awful sight one more time, then went back upstairs, forcing himself to keep a measured pace. Josephine was there waiting, holding a half-pack of stale Ritz biscuits.
"Good news. Carter has something to show you in the garage,"
said Josephine, before concern flashed over her face.
"Jesus, you look like you saw a ghost, Ed. Are you okay?"
"Yeah. I found the cause of the smell, is all."
"Oh,"
said Josephine.
"Want to talk about it?"
"No," he said, without further explanation. "Come on." In the garage, he found Carter hanging out of the driver's door of a red Ford Focus whose roof had faded to a whitish pink.
"Cap, we have wheels,"
said Carter excitedly, patting the sill. Its humming engine was music to Crowley's ears.
Over 3/4 of a tank in her, so I put the siphon fuel in back, in case Sergeant's team finds another vehicle.
Well done. Now pull it out of here before we all asphyxiate. Carter laughed and jumped back in, then slowly pulled out onto the driveway. Billy, can you drive us back?
Well, sure,
replied the older man, without asking why. Great, said Crowley. He tapped the roof and beckoned Carter out. Let Billy have a drive, he responded to the raised eyebrow. You ride shotgun and keep an eye out for anything. Josephine grasped his hand and squeezed affectionately when the two men were in the car. She understood perfectly why he'd given Billy the wheel. He flashed her a smile and a nod before opening the back door. M'lady.
How did you go?
Teddy asked, when he and Dougie emerged to find Dustin had moved the truck out onto the drive. The big V8, while not the most economical option they could have hoped for, rumbled the sweetest tune Teddy had heard in a while.
Great. We have just under half a tank. Hopefully that will do.
Let's hope so.
You find any goodies, Dougie?
Dustin asked the kid, who was holding a bulging bag.
Yep,
he said, holding open the bag.
Some Gatorade and a few bottles of water.
Great,
Where's Maria?
Interrupted Teddy. Dustin looked around.
Sorry, I was busy with the truck. She was here 10 minutes ago. Fuck,
said Teddy.
Didn't I tell her to stay here? Come on, Dustin, you must have some idea.
The flustered soldier thought for a minute.
Wait, I think she said something about how cute that house across the way was.
He pointed at a Cape Cod-style home 4 doors down on the opposite side of the street.
Maybe she went over to look or check it for supplies.
Teddy was about to explode when he saw Dougie was gripping his hair with his right hand, clearly anxious at the raised voices and Maria's disappearance. Teddy put a hand on his shoulder.
It's okay, kid. I'll fetch her. She won't be far. You put that stuff in the truck. Dustin, take Dougie back to Casey's where the others are waiting on us. I'll find Maria and we'll come straight back on foot.
Dustin paused.
You sure? We still have no ammunition, and we haven't done a full sweep of... I'm sure. We're out of time. Get the truck and drinks back to the group. That's the priority. How long? 20 minutes, tops. Okay, but if you're not back, you know the captain will come looking, right? Yeah, I know it. He slapped the hood of the F-100. Go on, get going.
As Teddy reached the front gate of the house, they were pulling out onto the road and gave him a wave before rumbling off down the street. Teddy watched the truck disappear back west toward Casey's, then turned back and surveyed the house, hands on hips. He caught himself as he was about to yell her name. The whole street looked abandoned, but best not to draw any unwanted attention.
You better be in there, Maria,
he said under his breath, and pushed open the gate. He drew his knife as he walked down the path to the front door. The sound of the V8 had faded to an eerie silence, broken only by the leaves blowing in the wind. He winced at the loud creak a floorboard made when he stepped onto the porch, and froze in place for a second.
Christ, get a grip, O'Connor,
he berated himself, before tiptoeing to the door. It was ajar. He took a breath, then pushed it open slowly. The front door opened onto a long hallway with polished timber flooring. To the right was a large arched opening, leading into a tastefully decorated living room. There were 2 closed doorways on the left, and the end of the hallway opened into a large, open-plan kitchen. He twice called Maria's name softly, with no answer. If she had indeed entered this house, he had no doubt the kitchen would have been her first stop, so he headed down the hallway. He paused once halfway along to listen, but was greeted only with silence. He checked his surroundings before stepping into the bright, modern kitchen, his knife raised. It was empty, but what he saw on the kitchen island stopped him in his tracks. On the corner of the polished white stone countertop was the smear of a fresh, bloody handprint. With a sinking feeling in the pit of his stomach, He crept slowly to the countertop and checked the other side floor. There was no body, but what he saw did nothing to ease his fears. More blood was smeared on the timber floor, and a bloody trail interspersed with large human footprints led to an ornate open door in the far wall with a sign over it. Weinkeller. Teddy squatted and put a finger in the blood. It was fresh. Feeling sick with dread, he rose to his feet and, avoiding the bloody mess, silently approached the doorway. 11. Crowley noticed immediately that Billy seemed far more at ease, now they had a vehicle on the inventory. Within minutes, the old man's hands had soon loosened their grip of the steering wheel, and with his elbow hanging out of the open window, he could have been out on a Sunday drive. They were back at Casey's in 8 minutes or so, and as Billy eased the car to a stop out the front, Crowley couldn't help but smile at the kids waving and jumping at the window. Within seconds, they'd piled out and surrounded the car, with Stiles and Maureen and Dan looking just as happy, minus the jumping around.
"You'd think we just rocked up in a red Ferrari,"
said Carter as they climbed out.
"Better," said Stiles, clapping him on the shoulder. "We might be able to squeeze 8 bodies in this one."
"Debrief?" Crowley asked.
"All quiet, and nearly everyone got some sleep," said Stiles. "No sign of hostiles."
"Good. Let's hope Sergeant O'Connor had some luck," said Crowley, looking at his watch.
"What time are we at now?"
Billy asked, coming around. "I would say we have just under 4 hours left." It wasn't much time at all, and even with the vehicles, they were going to cut it fine, assuming they didn't hit any trouble. "Supplies for the run home?"
"Not great, just a handful of candy bars left, but we've managed to get 10 bottles of water together. We won't starve to death between here and there."
"No, we won't. Now we just need Teddy to deliver." Stiles sensed his anxiousness, as did Carter. His squad knew him well.
"Sir," Carter said, "should Stiles and I do a recon in the car?"
"No," Crowley said. "We need to preserve fuel, and besides, I don't want more men. Wait. You hear that?" After a second, they all heard the low rumble, and even the children quietened down. It grew louder and louder, and as one, they turned to face the end of the street.
"That's a V8, said Carter. "I wonder what they found."
Then, as it turned around the bend, Crowley caught sight of the baby blue F-100. There were more whoops and hollers from those assembled, but Crowley saw within seconds that there were only 2 occupants in the vehicle.
"Something's wrong," said Josephine next to him.
"Everyone, stand back," yelled Crowley, the tone of his voice quietening the celebrations immediately. Crowley rounded the front of the Ford as soon as it pulled to a stop, and was in Dustin's face before he could put his second boot on the asphalt. "Where the hell are the others?"
"Teddy stayed behind to find Maria, sir. Said it was priority to get the ride back here. Figured you'd understand. Sorry, Captain."
Crowley grabbed his vest and pulled him closer. "What do you mean, find Maria?"
"She went missing while we were distracted. He ordered me to come back, sir."
"God damn it!" yelled Crowley, before releasing him and turning to address everyone. "Listen up. Get everyone loaded up. You have 2 minutes. I want 2 kids to a seat in that Focus. Billy, you're driving. Everyone else in and on the back of the F-100. Dustin, you drive." He then gestured for his men to gather around. "We ride to wherever you last saw O'Connor and Maria. Dustin, you'll drop me, and then make for the edge of town. If we don't turn up by—" Crowley checked his watch, aware most of the group were looking at him like he had just gone mad. "By, let's say, 1500 hours, you go."
"That's cutting it fine, sir,"
Stiles said. "Do you have a better suggestion?" spat Crowley, still pumping with anger and fear.
"No, sir."
"Good. Let's get to it then." Within a few minutes, all the kids except Baby Ed were in the Focus, either side by side or 2 to a seat, or sitting on laps. Josephine had Baby Ed, and paused to kiss Crowley.
"Don't miss the rendezvous, Captain. Please."
"I'll do my best," he said, holding her gaze for a second before she climbed into the rear seat of the truck with Maureen and Dan. Stiles climbed into the F-100 beside Dustin, and everyone else, along with Crowley, climbed up onto the tray. He slapped the roof of the truck's cab. "Head out." After 10 minutes, Dustin slowed the truck to a halt at the mouth of a T intersection, and he and Stiles hopped out. Crowley jumped down next to them. "There, sir," he said, pointing to the house 3 doors down on the left. "That's where we found the truck. We think Maria went into that Cape Cod house. That's where the Sarge headed anyway." "Roger." He turned to Stiles. "Get to the edge of town and stop by that abandoned roadhouse. If we're not there by 1500 hours, you're in charge of getting them safely to Sioux Falls."
"Sir,"
said Stiles, saluting.
"Good luck, sir."
Crowley waved to Josephine, who turned to look through the rear window, raising a forlorn hand as they disappeared. Teddy paused at the door to the wine cellar and looked down the darkened stairwell. The thick trail of blood continued down the metal treads. He knew now that Maria was dead. No one could lose that amount of blood and survive. He knew what he should do. The responsible thing to do was to close and lock the cellar door and head back to the others. But he couldn't. He just couldn't leave without seeing the evidence of her death with his own eyes, or that tiny element of doubt would remain with him forever. No more than he could leave without dealing justice to whatever had done this to her. With one hand gripping the stainless steel handrail, the other his knife, he started carefully down the steps. Lying helpless at the bottom of the staircase with a broken neck, with a butchering freak for company, was not something he wanted to experience. He stepped off the last step onto the polished concrete. By the light of the kitchen above, he could just make out the hulking rows of wine racks either side of a long corridor, which faded into black after a few yards. It was from here he heard a horrible slurping sound, interspersed with a cracking and grinding noise. Holding his breath, conscious of his heart pounding in his chest, he wiped the sweat from his forehead and slowly reached for the long cord that dangled a few inches from his face. Clutching his knife harder, he crouched in readiness and pulled the cord. The harsh light was intense, and it took a split second for his eyes to adjust. Then his mouth dropped open, and a small, distressed noise came from the back of his throat. 20 feet away, in the aisle that split the racks on either side, was a hunched, pale creature, feasting on what remained of Maria. Clearly, it had been a human at some point in its existence, but now was nothing more than a misshapen ghoul. So intent was it on its meal that it didn't register the light, or the fact that it was not alone. The warmth of righteous rage slowly melted the frozen horror that had almost rendered Teddy immobile. He began towards the creature. Its hunched back heaved as it fed, its jaw crunching down on bone and cartilage, oblivious to the danger it was in. Teddy raised his knife, and had almost readied himself to leap onto the creature when his boot slipped in the blood on the floor, and as he flung his hand out to steady himself, he knocked several bottles of wine to the floor. Preternaturally fast, the rabid half-man turned its head. Teddy's guts turned to water when he saw its gore-streaked maw. The creature's face was almost all mouth and teeth, and it opened wide in a horrible screech before it skittered around on all fours and leapt for him. Teddy cried out and fell backwards, raising his elbow and jamming it under the chin of the creature in its wildly thrashing jaws and slavering fangs. Its clawed hands began to rip and claw at his flak jacket, trying to get at the vulnerable flesh beneath. He brought his knife hand up and tried to stab it in the side of the head, but the blade glanced off the knobby skin and bone again and again. Irritated by the persistent blade, the creature roared, its rancid breath warm on Teddy's face as it smashed his hand away. The knife flew from his grasp, sliding under the wine rack. "No," he grunted, and somehow managed to shove the creature hard enough to push it off to the side.
He scrabbled away on hands and knees towards the knife whose handle he could just see. A big claw gripped his ankle, halting his progress, and began to inexorably drag him backwards. Teddy thrashed about, kicking, and gave a solid boot to its jaw, causing it to rear up and scream. It released him. Teddy burst forward, crawling like a maniacal toddler, and reached for the knife. He grabbed it. He felt a searing pain as the creature stabbed its claws into the flesh behind his knee. Teddy spasmed in pain again and flipped his body around, slashing as hard as he could. His blade cut only air as the rabid half-man reeled back, its yellowish eyes regarding him with ravenous intelligence. The filthy, torn remains of a shirt hung off its misshapen chest and shoulders. Hanging from the pocket was a badge with a smiley face and a printed name tag. "I'm Bob, and I'm here to help." "Dear God," Teddy breathed. "What the hell happened to you, Bob?" In answer, the creature that used to be Bob lunged for him, both clawed hands raised, and its fang-lined jaw open wide. Teddy rolled to the right and swiveled, stabbing it hard in the back as it flew past, his blade biting deep into its flesh. The monster screamed and scurried away. Again it paused, now positioned between Teddy and any escape. With eyes pained, it tried to reach behind itself to dislodge the offending weapon, but soon gave up and coiled for another attack. Teddy sighed and stood full height, closing his fists and raising them. "Come on, Bob. Let's finish this." Bob roared and rushed at Teddy, who hit him with a hard right hook that pushed the big creature's shoulder first into the rack. Teddy then unleashed a left hook on the incredibly hard cheek of the creature and heard the crack of bones breaking in his hand. "Motherfuck!" The curse was punched out of his mouth by a swipe of the creature's open hand. Teddy was lifted 2 feet into the air and slammed back first into the wine rack on the left, where he fell to the floor amongst broken bottles and red wine mingling with Maria's blood. The creature was on him in a second, and it was all he could do to bring his left hand up and grip its neck, trying to keep its thrashing teeth from his face. The creature's hands pounded and clawed at his sides as it forced its horrifying face closer and closer to his. Teddy reached around and twisted the knife in its back with his right hand, but it was embedded so hard he couldn't pull it free. This brought a grunt of pain and renewed effort from the creature. Drops of saliva and blood dripped from its stinking maw onto his face. Teddy felt his strength giving out, and with one last desperate effort, dropped his right hand to feel the floor around him for something, anything. Crowley entered the house and cautiously walked along the hallway to the kitchen. His brain had barely absorbed the sight of blood as he rounded the kitchen bench, when he heard an inhuman roar from the open door on the other wall. He broke into a sprint, knife at the ready. Teddy's fingers found something rounded, hard, and sharp. Ignoring the pain, he closed his slick fingers around the neck of the broken wine bottle and shoved the jagged open end hard up under the creature's jaw. He dragged the glass across its neck with all of his might, opening a deep gash that spewed blood into his face. The creature reared up, slamming its hand against the wound, but to no avail. Deep red gouts of blood spurted between its clawed fingers with every waning pump of its heart. Teddy pushed the mortally wounded creature off himself and rose unsteadily to his feet. His eyes fell on Maria's staring eyes, then down to her torn and empty ribcage. Something snapped inside him. He kicked the creature in the jaw, and it collapsed to the floor. Teddy stepped over it, tears streaming from his eyes. He raised his leg, bringing the heel of his boot hard down on the side of the creature's head. Then again. Red filled his vision as he mechanically slammed his boot down over and over again, determined to stomp it into mush. He didn't stop until he felt strong hands grip his arm, and a harsh, familiar voice calling his name. 12.
In the end, Crowley had to subdue his agitated and injured sergeant in a bear hug and drag him backward, away from the monstrosity on the floor. "Teddy, it's done, pal. You took care of it." Teddy tried to burst free once more, but Crowley held tight and finally felt his second-in-command sag into his arms. "Are there more?" Crowley asked gently, as Teddy shook his head and weakly pointed at Maria's body.
"I wasn't in time,"
he said, his sentence punctuated by a heavy sob. Crowley put his arm around his shoulders. "You did what you could, T. She was already gone before you set foot in this house." Teddy nodded, unable to speak. Crowley took in his swollen and bloody face, the cuts on his arms and legs, and his shredded body armor, and realized how close he had also come to losing his friend. "Come on. We've got to go. We'll miss the ETA if we don't. Can you walk?"
"Yeah,"
he said, looking down at the wound on his leg. The flow of blood had eased, and for now at least, it wasn't hurting too much. He took a step after Crowley.
"Wait, what about Maria?"
"She's gone, Teddy. We have to leave her." He checked his watch and saw they had less than 5 minutes to make the rendezvous. Maybe they were already too late. "Come on, we need to go. Now." The urgency in his commander's voice put paid to any protest he might have made, and he limped after Crowley, who was already heading for the staircase. They paused at the front door and scanned the street. Teddy pointed, but Crowley had already seen it. A dog at the eastern end of the street. Mean, ugly, deformed. Another appeared behind it. Then another. Shit. Littermates. They watched for a moment. Then the small pack disappeared down the side of a house. Crowley looked at Teddy and signaled they would make their exit and head west down the street, which fortunately was the direction they had to go. The captain was about to step out when 2 more shapes appeared, sniffed the ground, and then followed the scent of their packmates down the side of the same house. Crowley counted out 30 seconds, then beckoned. "Leave the door open," Crowley whispered, as Teddy began to pull it shut.
"Forgive me, Maria,"
Teddy thought, understanding immediately that his captain hoped the strong smell of blood would cover their scent and entice the hungry predators inside to eat. They exited and headed as fast as they dared down the path, and then onto the asphalt.
"They're still here, hunting. They know we are here," said Teddy when he judged it safe. "When is the ETA?"
Crowley checked his watch. 1500. Now. Between the bruising and blood, Crowley saw the color drain from Teddy's face.
"Great. We've missed it."
"We don't want to bring the dogs down on our people anyway," Crowley said, his eyes staring off into the distance, hoping Stiles had followed his orders.
"I know.
We're on our own." It was just the 2 of them against the deadly mutts, but this time, with no weapons beside their knives, fists, and feet. They both knew it would take a miracle to make it out alive. Once, or if they managed to do that, they could worry about what was next, then. "Come on," Crowley said, leading the way. They had gone a few hundred yards, mostly sticking to the front yards of the homes that lined the quiet streets, when a howl back the way they came made both of them pause and raise the hairs on the back of Crowley's neck. It was answered by the enthusiastic barking of multiple dogs. The pair hunkered down behind an overgrown bush in the shade of a neat bungalow.
"I think they found,"
Teddy began. "Yeah," said Crowley, to cover the awkwardness. He was hoping the animals would spend some time down in the cellar, but didn't want to verbalize it because that would inevitably lead to what they were doing. "Let's make a move while they are distracted." He led the way out onto the road, sacrificing stealth for a faster pace. Crowley pointed north. "A few blocks that way, and we should hit the road out of town and back to the interstate," he said, over Teddy's harsh breathing. Teddy O'Connor nodded, and put on a fresh burst of pain, causing him to wince and put a hand to his side. "Are you okay?" Crowley said. Teddy nodded, but he was falling behind in speed, and it wasn't long before he was a few paces behind his captain. Crowley slowed, but only enough that he didn't lose Teddy, and still maintained a reasonable pace, all the while listening for pursuit over Teddy's ragged breathing. Finally, in the distance, he spotted a chain-link fence, and beyond that, a field. He was about to tell Teddy that they just had to get over that fence when he heard a scuff and a thud behind him. He skidded to a halt and turned to find Teddy face down in the road, attempting to get back to his hands and knees. Crowley ran back to help him. He reached down, but O'Connor slapped his hand away.
"You go, Ed. I'm done."
"No can do, soldier. Come on, see that fence in the distance? The road out is only 100 yards beyond. Come on, up and at 'em."
"No, Cap. I'm cooked. Leave me."
"Bullshit. You're being a drama queen," Crowley said, grabbing his wrist and pulling him to his knees. Teddy groaned, but raised one knee and planted a boot.
"What did you call me?"
"A drama queen," repeated Crowley, coaxing his old friend to his feet where he steadied him. "What are you going to do about it?"
"Well, kick your ass. That's—"
Distant barking interrupted him.
"Shit."
"Come on, they're on our trail now." Crowley dragged Teddy along. They reached the chain-link fence in a little under 3 minutes, but the barking behind them was much louder now. Teddy grabbed the fence and bent over double, regaining his breath as Crowley looked up at the strands of barbed wire that ran the length of the fence, then left and right for an opening. Nothing. It was up and over, or face whatever was behind them. "Come on, I'll give you a boost." Teddy, apparently deciding that he did want to live, put his heel in Crowley's interlocked hands and grasped the wire about 2 feet below the top, struggling his way up the incline. Crowley didn't waste any time and began to climb too. He saw Teddy get to the top and gingerly grasp the top rung of the barbed wire section with first one hand, then the other, and pull himself up the last few inches to the top. Luckily, the barb arms that the wire looped through were angled down and away from their side of the fence. When he got to the top, the sergeant managed, with a lot of swearing, to pull himself onto it and balance while he caught his breath. Crowley was halfway up the 12-foot height when the toe of his boot slipped, and he dangled on the fence momentarily, scrabbling desperately to find purchase.
"Shit, Cap. Come on. They're here."
To emphasize his point, excited barking broke out, and the animals, having spotted their quarry, broke into a full sprint. Crowley's boot found a hold, and he raised himself another foot, then looked over his shoulder. One dog was faster than the others, ahead of them by at least 15 yards. It was a nightmarish greyhound with one bulging eyeball, standing at least 4 feet tall at the shoulder.
"Hurry the fuck up, Crowley!"
Teddy screamed. Crowley climbed another foot, but could now hear the dog's pounding paws and its heavy, excited breathing. He pulled himself against the fence so that his face was pressed against the wire, and held himself in place one-handed while he used his right hand to free his knife. Teddy made a noise deep in his throat, and an instant later Crowley was struck by a freight train in the center of his back. The fence ballooned outward, and then, like a vertical trampoline, sprung backward, and flung both the captain and the rabid dog back onto the grass. Teddy, wincing from the barks cutting into him, watched helplessly as his friend and the dog scrambled to their feet. Crowley was just a fraction quicker and slammed his knife through the dog's ear, skewering its brain. It fell to the ground without so much as a groan. Crowley struggled to pull his weapon free, but it was firmly fixed in the skull of the dog. Knowing it was useless, he gave up and stood up to face the 5 dogs streaking toward him. There was a thud behind him, and he turned to find a torn and bloody Teddy O'Connor limping over to him. "No, Teddy, what are you doing?"
"You didn't think I'd let you have all the fun, did you?"
he said, handing Crowley his knife before bending to pick up a fist-sized stone. Crowley shook his head as the dogs closed within 50 feet, one just ahead of another, with 3 in a cluster a few yards behind.
You idiot. Now we're both goners.
Yes. It's been an honor, Captain.
Crowley had no time for a comeback as he crouched and then charged at the first animal. Teddy coiled his arm and smashed the rock down on the head of the dog that came for him, skipping to the side like a bullfighter as it hurtled by. Crowley was already engaged with the lead dog, managing to avoid the slavering, snapping fangs, but unable to use his knife to inflict any real damage. Teddy started to limp towards the last three. If he could just... The deep, menacing growl behind him put paid to any thought that there might be a way out of their predicament. Teddy turned his back on the approaching dogs and faced the one he had clunked on the head. It was bleeding profusely, blood running down its skull, around its eyes and muzzle, lending it a demonic look. It was more wary now, so Teddy had time to shape up and raise the rock again, as the struggles of Crowley and the other dog provided a disturbing soundtrack to his last stand. Tensing, O'Connor gritted his teeth as he waited to be taken down from behind. He was startled when the bloody dog in front of him barked a deep, coughing bark twice in succession, and the dogs that were nearly on him skidded to a stop. Their heavy panting and whining seemed tinged with disappointment.
"Oh, I get it," he said. "Okay then, fucker. Let's finish this." "We can't leave them,"
Josephine said to Stiles at the rendezvous point.
"Those are the captain's orders, ma'am. We have to think of the group,"
Stiles said unhappily. They were facing off between the two loaded vehicles.
"Just 5 more minutes." "No, ma'am. We've already given them 5. The captain will have my ass—" "No, the captain won't, because he'll be dead."
A few of the other civilians echoed her sentiment with "yeah" and "she's right." If the soldiers agreed with her, they weren't saying it out loud. The chain of command was still deeply instilled in them.
5 more minutes won't hurt, son,
Billy reasoned.
"No, that's it. No more talk,"
said Stiles, anger and regret tinging his voice. He put his hand on his not-quite-empty sidearm.
"Get on the truck, ma'am."
13. Crowley's heartbeat thumped in his ears as he struggled to keep the gnashing teeth away from his face with both of his hands. The charnel breath of the dog was hot in his nose and mouth as it inched closer and closer. The hand holding his knife was slowly losing purchase on the upper jaw, and he knew at some point he was going to have to snatch it away and pray he got a strike in before the dog did. In his peripheral vision, he could see Teddy facing the big dog between him and the fence. In typical Teddy fashion, he was mouthing off at it. But Crowley was unable to see why he hadn't been taken down by the other dogs. His knife hand slipped before he could put any more thought into it, and the dog's jaws snapped down onto the wrist of his left hand. He screamed in agony as bones crunched under his uniform sleeve, but the pain brought with it an opportunity. He coiled his right arm and swung, stabbing the knife into the dog's neck, and was rewarded by a yelp. The jaws loosened, and he stabbed again and again, burying the knife and twisting it, then repeating the action twice more, until the heavy form of the dog slumped on top of him. Teddy roared and charged at the dog, which let out a snarl and met him mid-air as Crowley began to push the dog carcass off, sitting up only to meet the baleful eyes of the 3 dogs who had held off on Teddy. They readied themselves to pounce on Crowley.
Oh, shit,
he said under his breath, not registering the sound of a motor approaching at speed from behind him until the 3 dogs looked that way. A streak of red burst through the chain-link fence and barreled right over the 3 dogs, the Ford Focus skidding to a halt in the grass 30 feet distant in a tangled mess of wire and dog flesh. He tried to push the dog off his feet, but groaned in agony from the pain in his left wrist. As Josephine and Billy burst from the car, Crowley looked to the right. Teddy was bent over the dog, which was the size of a small pony, holding on for dear life with the fingers of one hand gripping its long, coarse hair and swinging at it with the rock in his other, somehow managing to evade its threshing fangs. It was clear he was weakening, though, and with a final push, the dog had him on his back. The rock rolled free,
and the dog lowered its head until it was an inch over Teddy's face, its lips peeling back from its gruesome fangs in what was almost a triumphant leer. Its display of bravado was its downfall, as it allowed time for a lumbering Billy to arrive and swing the aluminum baseball bat in his hands down hard upon the back of the dog. The dog collapsed onto Teddy with a shriek of pain and outrage that the human under him emulated. It tried to scramble back to its feet to face this new threat, but another blow rained down upon its already abused skull with a muffled crunch, and it finally lay still. Josephine arrived on the scene and began helping haul the dog off Crowley's legs as the puffing Billy bent over to look under the dog at the unmoving Teddy. For a moment, Crowley feared the worst. Then a muffled voice yelled, "Jesus Christ! Get this thing off me, will ya?" Josephine, teary-eyed from the loss of Maria, had told Crowley that Stiles was free of blame for the rescue mission as they drove back to the rendezvous point. When Josephine had ordered the kids out of the focus, Carter and Dustin had stood between her and the agitated Stiles and waited until she climbed in beside Billy. "It's not his fault, or theirs." Crowley nodded wearily. He would sort it out and work it out so that the relationship between his men was not damaged permanently. He couldn't blame Josephine. He would have done the same for her or any of his men, for that matter, if there was a chance to get them out alive. He put an arm around her shoulder. "I'm sorry about Maria." She cried some more, and Crowley was thankful Teddy had drifted into a fitful sleep. He was certain unwarranted guilt would eat at his friend for a long time. There were cheers all around when they arrived back, and even Stiles looked relieved, albeit relief tinged with anxiety. Crowley put him at ease right away by patting him on the shoulder as he was helped towards the tray of the F-100. Both Teddy and Crowley were lifted onto the tray of the F-100, where Josephine and Maureen began administering first aid. Miraculously, apart from Crowley's bite on the wrist that didn't break the skin thanks to the thick material of his uniform, neither had suffered bite marks. Only 18 minutes behind the departure time set by Crowley, they rolled out. Teddy had been sedated with the last of their medical stash so that Josephine could dress the wound on his leg. Crowley refused the medication, preferring to grit his teeth as they tightly wrapped his broken wrist and stay alert. Eventually, the motion and the steady hum of the V8 lulled him to sleep. The bump of a pothole a few hours later shocked him awake, and he pulled himself upright next to a pale Teddy. "You good?" he asked. "You mean after fighting off monsters and dogs? Or after being tenderized by a big lug with a baseball bat?" Crowley chuckled. "I'll take that as a yes, then." He looked up at Josephine, who was standing next to them, gripping the rail above the cab and looking ahead into the rapidly fading light. "We're 2 miles out," she said, as he struggled to his feet and planted himself next to her. Abandoned cars lined both sides of I-29 as they approached, and they passed at least 2 that were riddled with bullet holes. "That doesn't look welcoming," Josephine said over the roar of the wind. It didn't, Crowley agreed. But they weren't about to turn around, having come this far. They were well inside the city limits as the last of the sunlight dipped in the west, and Crowley began to wonder if the whole thing had been a practical joke. He was about to say as much to Josephine when she pointed ahead at what could only be described as a wall. It stretched away to the east and west on the flat land, and as they drew closer, Crowley saw that it was about 10 feet high, built of broken cars, bricks, sheets of wood and metal, old refrigerators, and anything else whoever built it could get their hands on. The only break in the wall of junk was a gate on the road 200 yards in front of them. He had just made out moving shapes on the wall and behind the gate when suddenly the world lit up as 2 massive mobile towers of floodlights behind the gate snapped on. Crowley allowed himself some elation. Those lights meant civilization and long-sought sanctuary for the people he had managed to drag this far. Time to grieve for the rest later.
He banged the roof of the F-100 to signal Dustin to slow down. Crowley checked his watch. They had missed the curfew by 17 minutes. But damned if he was going to turn around. They'd have to shoot him first. Armed men in U.S. Army uniforms spilled through the gate and ran towards the trucks.
"Halt!"
said the lead man. By the harsh light, Crowley could see his sergeant's insignia and the no-nonsense look on his face. When the truck pulled to a stop, he jumped down and drew himself up to his full height. After giving the man a second to take in his uniform and rank, he saluted. "Edward George Crowley, Captain, 3367268. You are?" The man's eyes widened. Then after a pause, he saluted. Crowley breathed an inward sigh of relief.
"Sergeant Elijah Miller, sir. You missed the deadline. We are about to start sealing the gate. But I think the general will make an exception for you and your group," he said, taking in the rest of the uniforms in the group.
"Thank you." He waved for the others to exit their vehicles. "General's name?"
"Henderson, sir."
"Thomas Henderson?"
"Yes, sir."
Crowley nodded. Good. He didn't know Henderson personally, but his reputation was a good one. Miller gave his men the order, and suddenly there were upwards of 20 men surrounding the vehicles and helping his people out of the vehicles. Josephine came up beside him and grasped his hand as the sergeant spoke into his comms and ordered a van to transport the new arrivals for processing.
"You did it, Captain. You got us here."
He shook his head and gestured to the rest of the group. "No, Joe. We got us here." Epilogue. Captain Ed Crowley nursed a beer in his clean but worn fatigues as he stood against the rail of a rooftop overlooking the haven of Sioux Falls. The setting sun bathed the skyline in warm hues, casting a glow over the city. Josephine emerged onto the rooftop and approached, her hand resting protectively over her swollen belly. In 2 short months, they would welcome a new life into this world, a symbol of hope and renewal amidst the ruins. In the 12 months since they had arrived, the streets had been cleared and survivors housed. Now the city buzzed with life as survivors slowly rebuilt their shattered world. Order had been restored to the refuge that had heaved with anxiety and confusion when they first arrived. "Is Ed asleep?" Crowley asked.
"Yeah," she said. "I don't think his afternoon naps will last much longer. It's harder and harder to get him to sleep."
We might need to find a way to tire him out more. Playing with Uncle Teddy always seems to do the trick." As if on cue, the buzz of a small motor breached the silence. It was unusual given that almost all vehicles in the sanctuary were used sparingly, and one could go for days without seeing or hearing one. They looked over the rail and down the street. Neither of them were as surprised as they should have been when a moped took the corner wide and headed their way, ridden by none other than Teddy O'Connor.
"Look what I found,"
he yelled when he pulled to a stop and slammed the stand down. "Where the hell did you get that?" Crowley asked, unable to hide his smile. The trials they had faced together had forged an even more unbreakable bond than they'd had before the virus. Neither time nor Teddy's constant clowning could ever erode that bond.
"It's a long story. Best told over a beer. Can I come up?"
"Sure. Grab me one on the way up." Josephine leaned against Crowley's side, her eyes twinkling.
"Our kids will never be bored as long as Teddy is around."
"Nope," he laughed. Hours later, the 3 of them stood, silhouetted against the warm light of the homes below.
"A year ago, did you ever, in your wildest dreams, think we'd get to do something like this again?"
Teddy asked. "I had my doubts," Crowley said.
"We all had our doubts,"
echoed Josephine, holding her belly. Teddy drained his beer.
Yep. We are lucky sons of bitches, all right.
The end. You've been listening to Endgame, Book 5, and the final installment of RABID State series. Written by Scott Medbury. Narrated by Adam Barr. I'm Adam Barr. Thanks for listening.
If you're enjoying Scott's audiobook content, please like and subscribe. It's the best way to help out the channel.